The doctor's words still echoed in my head. 6 weeks. After that, the cancer spreads. I needed $42,000 for the surgery that would save my life. So, I called my mother. "Mum!" I whispered through tears, my hand shaking around the phone. "Please, I might die." Silence, then cold as ice. "We're saving $230,000 for your brother's wedding." In the background, I heard champagne glasses clinking, wedding music, laughter, my brother's voice. "Mom, tell her we'll pray for her." Then he giggled. Actually, giggled. My mother's final words before hanging up. "Don't make this about you, sweetheart." I stared at the hospital ceiling, that night tubes in my arms, completely alone. And that's when I made a promise. I would survive this, and I would make sure they paid for every single betrayal. What I discovered next about my family wasn't just favoritism. It was fraud, theft, lies that went back decades. By the time I was done, my golden boy brother would lose everything he stole. And my mother, she'd finally see which child was worth saving. This is the story of how I became the daughter they should have feared. Stay with me, because revenge is a dish best served with receipts. My name is Sarah Mitchell. I'm 35 years old, and for the past decade I've built a successful career as an interior designer in Portland, specialising in modern residential spaces. I've always been independent, self-sufficient, the kind of person who figured things out on her own. I had to be. But nothing in my carefully constructed life prepared me for what Dr. Morrison told me on that Tuesday afternoon in March. "I'm sorry, Sarah," she said, her hands folded on the desk between us. "The biopsy results confirm it's malignant. Stage 2, aggressive carcinoma. We need to move quickly." The words seemed to come from underwater. Stage 2, malignant, aggressive. I heard them, but they felt like they belonged to someone else's story, not mine. "What does quickly mean?" I managed to ask. Dr. Morrison leaned forward, her expression gentle but urgent. "You have a 6-week window for surgery. After that, the cancer will likely spread to stage 4 and treatment becomes significantly more complicated. The surgery and immediate follow-up care will cost approximately $42,000 after insurance. $42,000. I felt the air leave my lungs. My savings had been depleted 6 months earlier when I'd put a down payment on expanding my studio. I'd been so careful, so responsible my entire life. And now, when it mattered most, I didn't have enough. "I understand this is overwhelming," Dr. Morrison continued, "but I need you to understand the timeline. 6 weeks. We can schedule you for the end of April if you can secure funding by next week." I nodded numb and somehow made it to my car before the tears came. That evening, sitting in my small apartment with the test results on my coffee table, I did something I hadn't done in years. I called my mother for help. The phone rang 3 times. When she answered, I could hear music in the background voices, the clink of glasses. "Mum," I said, and my voice cracked. "Mum, I need to talk to you. It's important." "Sarah, sweetheart, this isn't really a good time. We're at the Four Seasons looking at reception spaces for Ethan's wedding. Hold on." The music grew louder, then muffled. She must have stepped away. "What is it?" I closed my eyes. "I got some test results back today. It's cancer. I need surgery and I need it within 6 weeks or it spreads. Mum, I need help. I need $42,000. Silence stretched between us. In the background, I heard someone laugh. A champagne cork popped. "Sarah?" my mother said finally, her voice cold and distant. "Your brother is getting married in 3 months. Do you have any idea what weddings cost these days? We're spending $230,000 to give Ethan and Melissa the day they deserve." "Mom, I might die." "Don't be dramatic. I'm sure you can work something out. Maybe ask your friends or get a payment plan with the hospital. We simply can't help right now. All our money is allocated." Before I could respond, I heard my brother's voice. "Mom, who is it? We need to decide between the orchids and the peonies." "It's your sister," my mother said, not even bothering to cover the phone. "She wants money." Ethan's voice came clearer now. He must have taken the phone. "Hey, Sarah, listen, we'll pray for you, okay? But Mom's right. This wedding is a huge investment. I'm sure you'll figure something out. You always do." Then I heard it, a giggle, high-pitched, careless. Melissa's voice in the background. "Babe, they have chocolate fountain options." Ethan laughed with her, actually laughed. "Gotta go, sis. Wedding planning calls." The line went dead. I sat there in the darkness of my apartment phone, still pressed to my ear, listening to the dial tone. A nurse at the hospital had given me a pamphlet about cancer support groups, support systems, the importance of family during treatment. I looked at it now, sitting on my coffee table next to the test results. Family. The word felt like a joke. That night I lay awake staring at my ceiling, watching shadows shift across the plaster. My hand drifted to my chest where beneath skin and bone cells were dividing, multiplying, preparing to kill me. And somewhere across town, my mother and brother were probably toasting with champagne, discussing flower arrangements and string quartets. Something shifted inside me in that darkness. Something hard and cold and crystalline. I made myself a promise as the first light of dawn crept through my window. I would never beg them for anything again, and I would never, ever forget this night. But as I lay there in the darkness, unable to sleep, unable to stop the thoughts racing through my mind, I realised something else. This wasn't the first time my family had made me feel invisible. It was just the first time the consequences might actually kill me. Memories I'd buried for years began surfacing, one after another, like photographs spilling from a forgotten box. I was 8 years old again, standing in the gymnasium of Lincoln Elementary School. My watercolour painting of our family garden had won first place in the youth art competition. I could still remember the way my heart had soared when Mrs. Peterson announced my name, the weight of the blue ribbon in my small hands, the applause echoing off the walls. I'd rushed home that afternoon, bursting through the door, desperate to show my mother. She was on the phone, her back to me. I know, she was saying. "Ethan's team lost 3-1. He's devastated. I'm thinking we should do something special to cheer him up." "Mum," I'd interrupted, waving my ribbon. "Mum, look, I want..." She'd held up one finger, not even turning around. "That's nice, sweetie. Go put it on the fridge." That evening, 20 kids descended on our house for an impromptu pizza party. My mother had ordered 5 large pizzas, bought a sheet cake from the bakery, and hung a banner that read, "You're all winners," in our living room. Ethan, who'd spent most of the soccer game picking dandelions in the outfield, was the centre of attention. Parents congratulated my mother on being so supportive. My blue ribbon stayed on the fridge for 2 days before disappearing under a stack of Ethan's spelling tests. The memories kept coming, each one sharper than the last. I was 16, working the evening shift at Morrison's Diner 3 nights a week. My junior prom was in 2 months, and the dress I wanted cost $150. I'd been saving every tip, every dollar. My hands smelled like grease and coffee no matter how many times I washed them. I'd come home after closing at 11, exhausted, and find my mother and Ethan watching movies together on the couch, sharing a bowl of popcorn. "How was work?" My mother would ask absently, her eyes never leaving the screen. "Fine," I'd say, and trudge upstairs alone. 2 weeks before prom, I finally had enough money. I was counting bills on my bed when I heard shouting from downstairs. I found Ethan in the driveway, my father beside him, and my mother standing on the porch with her hand over her mouth. A brand new Honda Civic sat in the driveway, silver and gleaming with a giant red bow on the hood. "Surprise," my father had said, grinning. "We know you've been anxious about getting your license, son. Figured this might help build your confidence." Ethan was 16, just like me. He'd failed his driver's test twice. The car cost $18,000. That night at dinner, I'd mentioned I'd finally saved enough for my prom dress. My mother had smiled vaguely. "That's wonderful, dear. It's so important to learn financial responsibility." I bought the dress. I went to prom. Nobody in my family asked to see pictures, but it was college that really showed me where I stood. I was a good student, good enough to get into Oregon State's design program. When the acceptance letter came, I'd been thrilled. When the financial aid package came, I'd been terrified. Even with scholarships, I'd need to take out $80,000 in loans over 4 years. That's the investment you make in yourself, my father had said, not looking up from his newspaper. Builds character. You'll appreciate your education more if you work for it. 3 months later, Ethan announced he was going to the University of Portland. Private school, $60,000 a year. I'd watched my parents write the first tuition check without blinking. It's different with Ethan, my mother had explained when she caught my expression. He needs more support. You've always been so independent, Sarah, so capable. Ethan's more sensitive. Sensitive. That was the word they always used. Ethan was sensitive. Ethan needed encouragement. Ethan was their miracle baby. I'd heard that phrase my entire life. My miracle baby. My mother would say it with this dreamy look in her eyes, like she was remembering something sacred. She'd stroke Ethan's hair even when he was too old for it and whisper, "My precious miracle." I never got an explanation. When I asked once at 13, my mother had just smiled. "You wouldn't understand, Sarah. It's complicated." My father's response was always the same whenever I questioned the difference in treatment. "Sarah's the strong one," he'd say like it was a compliment. "She doesn't need as much help. She's got that independent streak." Independent, strong, capable. I grew to hate those words because I knew what they really meant. They meant I was on my own. They meant I didn't matter as much. They meant whatever I achieved would be expected, while whatever Ethan failed at would be forgiven. I put myself through college working 2 jobs. I graduated with honours and $80,000 in debt. Ethan graduated 2 years later with a mediocre GPA 0 debt and a $20,000 check from our parents to get started in life. When I opened my design studio, I did it with a small business loan and money I'd saved working 60-hour weeks for 3 years. When Ethan started his consulting firm, our parents invested $50,000 and threw him a launch party at the country club. "You understand, don't you, Sarah?" my mother had said when I didn't attend. "You've already proven you can do things on your own. Ethan needs to know we believe in him." And I'd nodded. I'd always nodded. Because that's what the strong, independent, capable daughter did. She handled it. She didn't complain. She didn't need the validation, the support, the love that flowed so freely toward her brother. Lying in my bed, now facing cancer alone, I finally understood the truth that I'd been avoiding my whole life. I wasn't strong. I wasn't independent by nature. I'd had to become those things because I'd been given no choice. And my family had used those forced traits as an excuse to neglect me further. The miracle baby. My mother's precious Ethan. I'd spent 35 years watching him be treasured while I was tolerated. Watching money pour into his life while I scraped by. Watching him fail upward while I fought for every inch of ground. And now when I was facing death, they'd chosen his wedding over my life. Because in the end, I was still just Sarah, the strong one, the one who'd figure it out, the one who didn't need them. I didn't know then that miracle baby was a lie with deadly consequences. But in those first few days after my family abandoned me, I had more immediate problems to worry about, like how to stay alive. I spent the next 72 hours in a fog of phone calls and paperwork, medical payment plans that would take 15 years to pay off, personal loan applications that were denied because my debt-to-income ratio was already too high from my business expansion, credit cards with interest rates that made my stomach turn. I made spreadsheets at 2 a.m, calculating and recalculating numbers that never added up to enough. Dr. Morrison's office called twice to check if I'd secured funding. The surgery scheduler needed an answer. The 6-week clock was ticking loud as a time bomb in my head. On the third day, I was back at the hospital for pre-surgical blood work. I sat in the waiting room forms on my lap staring at the line that asked for payment method. My hand hovered over the checkbox for payment plan, knowing it would take a decade to crawl out of the debt, knowing I had no choice. Sarah Mitchell, a woman from the billing office, appeared in the doorway. "Could you come with me, please?" My heart sank. They probably wanted to discuss the payment arrangements before I could even get the blood work done. I followed her down a hallway to a small office with motivational posters about healing and hope on the walls. She gestured to a chair and sat down across from me, pulling up something on her computer screen. "Ms. Mitchell, I'm calling you back here because there's been a development with your account." She looked at me with an expression I couldn't quite read. "Your surgery has been paid for. In full." I stared at her. "What?" "This morning, a gentleman came in and paid the entire $42,000 in cash. He said he wanted to remain anonymous. Left no contact information, no name, nothing." The room seemed to tilt. "That's not possible. Nobody I know has that kind of money just lying around." She turned her monitor toward me. There it was, in the hospital's billing system. Balance, 0 Ohio Towns. Payment received, $42,000. Payment method, cash. "I don't understand," I whispered. "Neither do we, honestly. It's highly unusual, but the money is real. It's been verified and deposited. Your surgery is fully funded." She smiled gently. "Whoever this person is, they wanted you to live, Miss Mitchell. They wanted that very much." I walked out of that office in a daze. My hands were shaking so badly I had to sit down in the hallway. Someone had saved my life. Someone had paid $42,000 in cash to save my life. But who and why, anonymously, I went through my mental catalogue of everyone I knew. My college roommate Claire was a successful attorney, but we hadn't been close in years. My clients liked me, but not $42,000 worth. My friends were designers and artists, people who understood struggling to make rent, not people with that kind of cash on hand. After the blood work, I was walking back through the hospital lobby when I saw my reflection in a window and realised I was crying. A nurse at the station noticed and hurried over. "Honey, are you all right? Do you need to sit down?" I shook my head, wiping my face. "I'm fine. I'm good, actually. Someone just paid for my surgery. Anonymously." Her face lit up. "Oh, you're the one we heard about that. Such a beautiful thing. The man who came in this morning, he looked so sad when he left." Something in my chest squeezed tight. "You saw him just briefly. Older gentleman, maybe late 60s. He had a veteran's cap on one of those with the VFW pins. Kept his head down, didn't want to talk much. But before he left, he asked me to make sure you got this." She reached into her pocket and pulled out a small white envelope. "He said it was under your pillow in pre-op, but housekeeping found it and brought it to the desk. I've been waiting for you to come back through." My hands trembled as I took the envelope. It was light, probably just a card inside. I opened it carefully. Inside was a small piece of hospital stationery folded once. The handwriting was shaky, but deliberate, written in blue ink that had smudged slightly in one corner. "You matter. Stay alive." 4 words, no signature. But something about that handwriting tugged at a memory I couldn't quite grasp. I'd seen it before somewhere. On birthday cards, maybe, or old letters. The way the Y curved, the way the capital S looped at the top. "Do you know who it was?" I asked the nurse, my voice barely above a whisper. She shook her head. He didn't give a name, but he looked like he'd been carrying something heavy for a long time, and when he left, his shoulders were a little lighter. She patted my arm. "Someone loves you very much, dear, even if they can't say it out loud." I made it to my car before the full weight of realization hit me. An older gentleman, late 60s, a veteran's cap. My father was 68. My father was a veteran Vietnam era, though he never talked about it. My father had that same shaky handwriting. From years of working with tools, from the slight tremor he'd developed in his right hand. I pulled out my phone and dialed his number, the one I'd programmed in years ago and rarely used. It rang once, then a mechanical voice. "The number you have reached has been disconnected." Disconnected. Not out of service. Disconnected. Deliberately turned off. I tried my mother's cell. It rang 4 times and went to voicemail. "Hi, you have reached Linda Mitchell. Leave a message and I'll call you back." "Mom, it's Sarah. I need to talk to Dad. Please call me back. It's urgent." I hung up and stared at my phone. Then I did something I hadn't done in months. I tried to call Ethan. The phone didn't even ring. Just a flat message. "The person you are trying to reach is not accepting calls from this number." He'd blocked me. My own brother had blocked my number. I sat in that hospital parking lot for 20 minutes holding that note in my hands, reading those 4 words over and over. "You matter. Stay alive." The handwriting that looked so familiar, but that I couldn't quite place. The disconnected phone number, my mother's silence, my brother's blocked calls. Someone had given me $42,000 to live. Someone who wore a veteran's cap and looked sad. Someone who didn't want credit or thanks or even acknowledgement. And suddenly, terribly, I wondered if my father was okay. I wondered when I'd last actually seen him, not just heard his voice in the background when my mother answered the phone. I wondered why his number was disconnected. I wondered what miracle baby really meant and what secrets my family had been keeping. I was alive, but suddenly I wasn't sure my father was. That thought haunted me as I drove home from the hospital. The mysterious note tucked in my purse, my father's disconnected number. A dark question mark in my mind. I spent the rest of that afternoon trying every way I could think of to reach him. I called my mother 6 more times. Voicemail every time. I tried Ethan's office number. His secretary said he was unavailable and would I like to leave a message? I left 3. He never called back. I even looked up my parents' home address on Google Maps, zooming in on the street view, as if I could somehow see through the walls to know if my father was okay. It was nearly 6 in the evening when my doorbell rang. I wasn't expecting anyone. For a wild moment, I thought maybe it was my father come to explain everything. Instead, when I opened the door, I found Claire Hendricks standing on my porch with a leather messenger bag over her shoulder and an expression that made my stomach drop. Claire and I had been roommates at Oregon State back when we were both young and ambitious, and staying up until 3 in the morning studying for exams. She'd gone on to law school specialised in divorce and family law, and now ran her own practice in downtown Portland. We drifted apart over the years, meeting for coffee maybe twice a year, exchanging Christmas cards. I hadn't even thought to tell her about the cancer. "Sarah," she said, and her voice was tight with something I couldn't identify. "I need to come in. We need to talk." I stepped back and let her enter. She walked straight to my dining room table and set down her bag with the kind of deliberate care people use when they're carrying something fragile or dangerous. "Claire, what's going on? How did you even know I was home?" She turned to face me, and I saw it then. Fear. Claire, who'd faced down hostile witnesses and aggressive opposing counsel, without flinching, looked genuinely afraid. "Your father sent me something 3 months ago," she said. "I've been holding on to it, trying to figure out what to do, but when I heard about your surgery, I realised I can't wait anymore." "You heard about my surgery, how?" "Your father called me this morning, from a payphone. He could only talk for a minute, but he told me you were sick, and that he'd helped you. He said it was time I gave you what he'd sent me." She reached into her bag and pulled out a manila folder, thick with papers. "Sarah, you gave me your dad's number 2 years ago. Remember, he was having that issue with the property tax assessment on the house, and you asked if I could give him some advice." I did remember. My father had been panicking about a sudden increase in their property taxes, worried they might lose the house. I'd connected him with Claire, who'd walked him through the appeal process. The assessment had been corrected. I'd forgotten all about it. "He called me again about 3 months ago," Claire continued. "Late at night. He sounded terrified, Sarah. He said, 'I'm scared. My daughter needs to know the truth. If anything happens to me, please give these to Sarah. Then he mailed me this. She opened the folder and spread papers across my dining room table. Bank statements, dozens of them. I recognized my father's bank logo, his account number partially redacted, but his name clear at the top. Harold Mitchell. I've been going through these, Claire said, her attorney voice taking over crisp and factual. Your father's pension deposits for $200 a monthly into his checking account. It's been consistent for 6 years since he retired. But look at these transactions. She pointed to highlighted lines on the statements. Transfers out, large ones, $15,000 in June 3 years ago, $20,000 in November that same year. Another $25,000 the following March. And more a pattern of withdrawals that made my head spin. Over the last 3 years, $180,000 has been transferred out of your father's account, Claire said quietly. All of it going to an account in your mother's name, an account she opened specifically to receive these transfers. I sank into a chair staring at the numbers. That's impossible. Dad would never give Mum that much money without telling me. And why would Mum need that much? That's what I thought too, so I did some digging. Claire pulled out another set of papers. These are the authorization forms for the transfers. The bank requires a signature for any transfer over $10,000. Look at the signature on these forms, Sarah. She laid 4 forms in front of me. Each one had a signature line at the bottom. Each signature read Sarah Mitchell in handwriting that looked exactly like mine. The way I looped my S. The way Hayem had that little uptick at the end. The way I crossed my T just slightly off-center. My mouth went dry. I didn't sign these. I know you didn't. Claire, I never signed these. I've never even seen these forms before right now. I know, she said again, and now I could hear the anger beneath her professional calm. Someone forged your signature, Sarah, 4 separate times over 3 years. They used your identity to authorize transfers from your father's account to your mother's account. That's identity theft. That's fraud. And that's $108,000 of your father's retirement money. I couldn't breathe. The room felt too small, too hot. Who would do this? Who could even forge my signature this well? Claire pulled out one more document, this one a photocopy of something that looked like it had been photographed secretly, the image slightly blurred. It was a notebook page filled with handwriting practice. My name written over and over. Sarah Mitchell. Sarah Mitchell. Sarah Mitchell. Dozens of attempts, each one getting closer to matching my actual signature. Your father found this, Claire said. He didn't write where, but given the context, I'm guessing it was in your brother's things. Ethan, my golden boy brother. The miracle baby who could do no wrong. I thought of his consulting firm, the one my parents had invested $50,000 in it. I thought of the Porsche, the expensive apartment, the lavish wedding they were planning. They used my name, I whispered. They stole from Dad and made it look like I authorized it. That's exactly what they did. Claire sat down across from me, her eyes fierce. Your father discovered this somehow. That's why he sent these to me. That's why his phone is disconnected. Sarah, I think your father is in trouble. I think once they realized he knew they isolated him. I thought of the note in the hospital. You matter. Stay alive. I thought of the sad man in the veteran's cap who'd paid $42,000 in cash and walked away with lighter shoulders. My father had given me everything he could. And what had my family done to him in return? There's more, Claire said and pulled out a final paper. I ran a credit check on you this morning with your information from when we worked on that contract together last year. Sarah, there are 3 credit cards in your name that you didn't open. They're maxed out. Someone's been using your identity for more than just bank transfers. The walls felt like they were closing in. My signature, my name, my identity stolen and used to rob my father blind. And somewhere out there my father was hiding, scared, alone, with a disconnected phone and whatever money he had left after saving my life. Claire looked at me with tears in her eyes, her voice breaking through her professional composure. Sarah, they didn't just steal from your dad. They stole your identity. And I think they're not done yet. Claire's words hung in the air between us like smoke. I stared at the documents spread across my table, my signature repeated over and over, on forms I'd never seen authorizing transactions I'd never approved. The handwriting practice sheet with my name written dozens of times felt like looking at my own ghost. How deep does this go? I asked, my voice sounding strange and distant to my own ears. Claire pulled her laptop from her bag and opened it, turning the screen toward me. I spent the last 2 days going through everything your father sent me and running additional searches. Sarah, the bank transfers were just the beginning. She pulled up a scanned document and I recognized the logo immediately. Pacific Health Insurance, the company that had provided my father's supplemental coverage since he retired. The document was a cancellation form dated from 2 years ago. Your father's supplemental insurance was cancelled 24 months ago, Claire said. That policy covered things Medicare doesn't, prescription specialist visits, emergency services. It cost $450 a month. Look at the signature authorizing the cancellation. There it was again, my name in handwriting that could have been mine on a form requesting cancellation of my father's medical coverage. The reason given was typed neatly in the box, policyholder requesting cancellation due to financial hardship. Dad never told me he cancelled his insurance, I whispered. Because he didn't. Someone cancelled it for him and forged your signature as his power of attorney. Sarah, this form claims you have legal power of attorney over your father's medical decisions. Do you? No, I've never had power of attorney over anything of Dad's. Claire's jaw tightened. Then this is medical fraud on top of identity theft. Whoever did this saved your parents $450 a month by eliminating your father's supplemental coverage. Over 2 years, that's nearly $11,000. I cross-referenced the dates with your brother's business records, which are public because he filed as an LLC. Guess when Ethan Mitchell Consulting received a capital investment of $11,000. I didn't need to guess. The pieces were falling into place like a puzzle I'd been too blind to see. The same time period. 2 months after the insurance was cancelled, the money saved went directly into funding your brother's business. Claire clicked to another document. And speaking of his business, look at this. It was an incorporation filing for Ethan Mitchell Consulting dated 3 years ago. I scanned the pages until I found what Claire was pointing at. Under initial investors and partners, there were 2 names, Ethan Mitchell, founder and CEO, and Harold Mitchell, silent partner with a listed investment of $50,000. Dad invested in Ethan's business. I felt a flicker of something not quite anger, yet just a hollow ache. Of course he had. He'd given Ethan everything else. No, Claire said firmly. He didn't. I called your father this morning before I came here. Remember, I asked him specifically about this. He had no idea his name was on these documents. He never signed anything. He never agreed to invest. Sarah, look at the signature on the partnership agreement. She zoomed in on the bottom of the page. Harold Mitchell signed in my father's careful, shaky handwriting. Except it wasn't shaky enough. The tremor my father had developed in his right hand, from years of construction work, the slight waver that made his signature distinct. It wasn't there. This signature was too smooth, too confident. That's not Dad's signature, I said. No, it's not. It's a forgery, just like yours. And that $50,000 investment, I traced it. It came from a home equity line of credit taken out on your parents' house. Someone forged your father's signature to get a $50,000 loan against the house, then used that money to fund Ethan's business, and made it look like your father was a willing investor. I thought I might be sick. Mum and Dad could lose their house. They're 2 payments behind right now. I checked the county records. There's a notice of default filed last month. The room spun. My father, who'd worked construction for 40 years, who'd built that house himself in 1985, who'd raised us in those rooms, was about to lose it. Because someone had stolen his signature, his equity, his security, and gambled it on Ethan's consulting firm. "There's more," Claire said quietly, and I wanted to scream at her to stop, that I couldn't take any more. But she was already pulling out another folder. "I hired a private investigator yesterday. He's good, discreet, used to work financial fraud cases for the DA's office. I had him do some surveillance on your brother's office." She laid out photographs. Ethan's office building, a modern glass structure in the Pearl District. Ethan himself walking in with his leather briefcase. And then, a photo that made my blood run cold. It was taken through an office window, zoomed in but clear enough. Ethan at his desk, a notebook open in front of him. The investigator had used a telephoto lens, and even from across the street I could see what was written on that page. My signature, over and over and over. Sarah Mitchell, Sarah Mitchell, Sarah Mitchell. Pages of practice, perfecting the curve of my letters, the angle of my slant, the pressure of my pen. "He's still practicing," Claire said, "which means he's planning to use your signature again. The question is, for what?" My hands were shaking so badly I had to clasp them together. "How long has he been doing this?" "Based on the documents, we have at least 3 years. But Sarah, here's what really worries me." Claire pulled out one more paper and her hand trembled slightly as she held it. "Your father included this in what he sent me. I've been trying to figure out how to tell you." It was a form from Cascade Life Insurance, the company that held my father's life insurance policy. A beneficiary change form. I scanned it quickly. Policy number, my father's name, the date, 18 months ago. Original beneficiary, Sarah Mitchell and Ethan Mitchell, equal shares. New beneficiary, Linda Mitchell, sole beneficiary. I looked up at Claire, not understanding. "Mum is the beneficiary now. That seems normal for a spouse." "Look at the policy value, Sarah." I looked back at the form. At the top, in bold print, policy death benefit, $2,000. $2 billion. My father had a $2 million life insurance policy, and 18 months ago, the beneficiary had been changed from me and Ethan splitting it to my mother receiving everything. And there, at the bottom of the form, authorizing the change, was a signature, Harold Mitchell. But I'd seen enough forged signatures today to recognize one when I saw it. This one was too smooth, too confident, missing that telltale tremor. "The policy has a double indemnity clause," Claire said softly. "If your father dies in an accident, the payout is $4 million. Then Claire showed me the last document, a life insurance beneficiary change form, and I stopped breathing. The beneficiary change form swam in my vision, the numbers blurring. $2 million. $4 million if the death was accidental. And my father's signature forged just like all the others, removing me and Ethan as beneficiaries and giving everything to my mother. "When did you say this was filed?" My voice came out as barely a whisper. 18 months ago, Claire said. Right around the time your father's supplemental insurance was cancelled. "Sarah, I need to show you something else, but I want you to prepare yourself. This gets worse." I didn't see how it could get worse, but Claire was already pulling up another file on her laptop. This one was a spreadsheet colour-coded and detailed in the way only an attorney's analysis could be. After your father sent me those documents, I started digging deeper. I requested his medical records. You can do that as an attorney investigating potential fraud, and I looked at his doctor's appointment history. She turned the laptop toward me. Your father had regular appointments with Dr. Nguyen at Portland Medical Center for years. Monthly checkups because of his diabetes and high blood pressure. Look at this pattern. The spreadsheet showed appointments in green, cancelled appointments in yellow, and missed appointments in red. For years, the chart was mostly green. Regular monthly visits, consistent care. Then about 8 months ago, the colours changed. Yellow, red, yellow, red. A solid block of missed and cancelled appointments, stretching right up to the present. 8 months of missed medical care, Claire said. I called Dr. Nguyen's office, said I was following up on a patient welfare concern. The receptionist told me that Mrs. Mitchell, your mother, had called multiple times to cancel appointments. She told them Harold was refusing treatment, that he didn't want to see doctors anymore, that he was becoming difficult about his health care. Dad would never refuse treatment. He's terrified of his diabetes getting worse. He checks his blood sugar 3 times a day. I know, so I pushed further. I got the pharmacy records. Claire pulled up another document. Your father's prescriptions haven't been filled in 3 months. His insulin, his blood pressure medication, his cholesterol medication. Nothing. The pharmacy tried calling the house several times. Someone they think it was your mother told them Harold had switched pharmacies. I felt cold all over. He needs those medications. Without insulin, his blood sugar could spike. He could go into diabetic shock. I know, Claire said grimly. And there's more. I pulled your parents' bank records, just the basic transaction history that's publicly available through the credit monitoring. Your mother has been withdrawing money from your father's pension every month, $1,200 labelled as medical care expenses and in-home nursing. Is Dad getting in-home nursing? No. I traced where that money actually goes. Direct deposits into your brother's business account listed as consulting fees. Your mother has been taking your father's pension, claiming it's for his care and funneling it to Ethan. The pieces were falling into place, forming a picture so ugly I wanted to look away. How much? Over the last 8 months, almost $10,000. Money that should have been keeping your father healthy, keeping him in his medications, paying for his doctor visits. Instead, it went to fund Ethan's business while your father's health deteriorated. I thought of my father alone, somewhere scared enough to send these documents to Claire months ago. Scared enough to disconnect his phone. Scared enough to pay for my surgery in cash and leave a note instead of talking to me directly. What had they done to him to make him that afraid? There's one more thing, Claire said and pulled out a small notebook. I talked to your parents' neighbours yesterday, the Chens on the left side of the house and the Pattersons across the street. Both families have known your parents for over 20 years. I remembered the Chens. Mrs. Chen used to give me oranges from her tree when I was a kid. Mr. Patterson had taught me how to change a tyre when I was 16. They said they haven't seen your father in about 2 months. Mrs. Chen tried to visit him 3 weeks ago, brought him some soup because she knew he'd been sick. Your mother answered the door and told her Harold didn't want visitors, that he was tired of people bothering him. Mrs. Chen said your mother looked angry that she'd even asked. Dad loves the Chens. He wouldn't turn them away. Mr. Patterson said the same thing. He tried to drop off some mail that got delivered to their house by mistake. Your mother took it and said Harold was resting, that he'd asked not to be disturbed. When Mr. Patterson asked if Harold was okay, your mother said he was just getting old and cranky, that he didn't want to deal with people anymore. Isolation. That's what this was. They were isolating my father, cutting him off from friends, from neighbours, from medical care, from me. The phone disconnection happened 6 weeks ago, Claire continued. I checked with the service provider. The account was cancelled by Linda Mitchell, claiming Harold no longer needed a cell phone. The mail is another issue. I can't confirm this completely, but Mrs. Chen said she noticed your father stopped getting mail at the house. She thought maybe they'd set up a PO box, but now I'm wondering if your mother had it redirected. And to where? Probably to her own address or a box she controls. Sarah, if someone is redirecting your father's mail, he's not getting his bank statements, his medical bills, any official correspondence. He's completely cut off. I stood up from the table, needing to move, needing to do something with the rage and fear building in my chest. This is insane. This is elder abuse. Why hasn't anyone reported this? Because from the outside, it looks like a wife taking care of her aging, difficult husband. The neighbours are concerned, but they don't have proof of anything wrong. The doctor's office thinks he's refusing treatment. The pharmacy thinks he switched providers. Everyone has a reasonable explanation fed to them by your mother. Claire stood two-facing me across the table, covered in evidence of systematic abuse. But Sarah, when you put it all together, the forgeries, the financial exploitation, the medical neglect, the isolation, this is a textbook elder abuse. And that life insurance policy with the double indemnity clause, it makes me think. She didn't finish the sentence. She didn't have to. If my father died under suspicious circumstances, my mother would get $4 million. And, with his medications withheld, his medical care cancelled, his health deteriorating, how long would it be before something happened? How long before the diabetes or high blood pressure or sheer stress caused a stroke, a heart attack, a fall down the stairs? How long before an accident occurred? Claire's voice shook when she finally spoke again. This isn't favoritism anymore. This is elder abuse. And Sarah, I think your father's in danger right now. Those words stayed with me all night. I didn't sleep. They throbbed in my head like a wound that wouldn't close. By dawn, I was sitting at the kitchen table, staring at the papers Claire had left proof of theft, forgery and neglect. My father's name appeared again and again, reduced to a line of numbers and signatures that weren't his. I was still weak from surgery, the incision under my ribs pulling when I breathed, but the fear for him burned hotter than any pain. At sunrise, I drove to my parents' house. The street looked the same, neat lawns, trimmed hedges, but something in the air felt hollow. The porch light was still on, though it was daylight. Dad never forgot to turn it off. When I tried my key, it jammed. They'd changed the locks. I knocked until my hand hurt. He turned out. Nothing. A curtain shifted, then stilled. I turned to the house next door. Mrs. Chen opened her door before I reached the steps, her face pale. Sarah. Oh, thank goodness. I prayed you'd come. I rushed toward her. Do you know where my father is? His phone's disconnected. Her eyes softened with pity. Your mother moved him out 2 months ago, said he needed more care. They took him in a van. He cried, Sarah. He kept saying he didn't want to go. I felt the world tilt. Did she say where Mrs. Chen hesitated? Then went inside and returned with a folded note. He gave me this, said to keep it safe for you. The paper was trembling in my hands, my father's handwriting thin and uneven. If you find this, look for me near the highway. It's not home. It wasn't much, but it was enough. I hugged her, whispered thanks, and got back into my car. For the next several hours, I drove from one facility to another, asking questions, showing his photo, hearing the same bored answers, no record. Not here, try the next place. By late afternoon, I was dizzy from exhaustion, my voice hoarse from pleading. I stopped at a gas station and asked the young cashier if she knew of a cheap nursing home nearby. She pointed down the road. Maple Pines! Old place smells bad, but folks say it's affordable. The building looked abandoned, brick walls stained with age weeds crawling through cracks in the parking lot. Inside, the smell of bleach couldn't hide the staleness underneath. A woman at the front desk looked up without much interest. I'm looking for my father, I said, handing her a picture. Harold Mitchell. Moved here about 2 months ago. She clicked at her keyboard. Room 212, visiting hours are over, but if you make it quick, I won't say anything. The hallway lights flickered. A TV blared somewhere, voices laughing over canned applause. My shoes squeaked on the linoleum as I walked to room 212. The door was slightly open. He was sitting on the bed, thin, stooped, wearing a sweater I'd given him 15 years ago. His hands rested on his knees, fingers twitching faintly. For a moment, I thought he might be asleep. Then he turned. His eyes widened confusion, melting into disbelief. Ashy, his voice broke. You're alive, I stepped closer, heart pounding. Dad, it's me! He pushed himself up, trembling. Linda said you died in surgery. She said you didn't want a funeral, that you didn't want me there. His breath hitched. I prayed every night for you. When I reached him, he clung to me as if afraid I'd vanish. I could feel the bones beneath his sweater sharp against my arms. I'm here, Dad. I'm okay, he sobbed quietly into my shoulder. When he finally sat down again, I knelt in front of him. I know what they did. Claire showed me everything, the transfers, the forged forms, the insurance. You weren't wrong. His eyes filled with tears. I thought I was losing my mind. She said I was confused that I couldn't handle bills anymore. But I knew. Ethan was always at the desk bringing papers for me to sign. I just didn't realise what I was giving away. You tried to warn me, I said softly. You sent the papers to Claire. You saved me. He looked down ashamed. I sold my car, he whispered, the old Chevy. Got just enough to pay the hospital. They wouldn't let me use the joint account. Said everything was for Ethan's business. I couldn't let you die, Ashy. My throat tightened. You paid for my surgery. He nodded slowly. You're my daughter. What else could I do? I wanted to cry, but I couldn't. The tears were there somewhere deep, but my heart had hardened around them. I just took his hand and held it tight. Thank you, Dad. You saved me. He smiled faintly. Worth every penny. He reached for the nightstand, retrieving a worn envelope. There's something else. I've kept this hidden. It's the original will, the one before your mother made me sign the new papers. It divides everything equally between you and Ethan. That's what I wanted. The envelope felt fragile in my hands, the paper inside yellowed with age. She made you sign a new one when you were sick. She waited until I was medicated. Said it was just an update. I didn't realise she had replaced your name until after I'd signed. When I tried to ask, she said I was confused. Then, she took my phone, said it was for my peace of mind. He looked around the bare room. And then, she brought me here. I could feel my pulse in my ears. You've been here for 2 months. He nodded. They don't let me out much. Meals, medicine, sleep. That's it. I thought maybe she'd changed, that she'd come back. But she never did. Dad, I said softly, we're getting you out. You're coming home with me, and I'm going to make this right. He studied me, the faintest smile touching his face. You look just like your mother did when she was young, he said, voice cracking. Same eyes. But you've got my stubbornness. I laughed weakly, the sound catching halfway to a sob. Guess that's what we'll need. His hand trembled as he touched my face. I'm so proud of you. I just wish I'd been braver when it mattered. You're brave now, I told him. That's enough. He leaned back, suddenly tired, his breathing shallow. I reached for his hand again. It was warm but frail in mine. He looked at me with an intensity that stilled everything around us. Take me home, baby girl, he whispered, and use that will to fight back. Promise me you'll fight. That was the last thing my father said before he fell asleep in my arms. The next morning, I kept my promise. The air outside Maple Pines was heavy with rain, the kind that makes everything feel washed clean but somehow heavier. I helped Dad into the car, wrapped him in my old college sweatshirt, and drove home in silence. He stared out the window the whole time, watching the grey blur of the world he hadn't seen in months. For the first time in years, I felt something like purpose rising inside me, not anger, not grief, but focus. By the time we reached my apartment, he was exhausted. I settled him into the guest room, the one I'd always meant to turn into an office, but never did. The sheets were fresh, the light soft. He looked around, slowly smiled and whispered, "Feels like home." That night, as he slept, I sat at my kitchen table surrounded by papers, bank statements, forged documents, the old will he'd given me. The evidence was all there, but scattered, raw and fragile. I needed a plan. The next morning, Claire came over carrying 2 coffees and a whiteboard under her arm. Her eyes went straight to the folder of documents spread across the table. "We're doing this properly," she said. "No guesswork." She pulled out sticky notes, colour-coded markers, and started writing. At the top of the board, in thick red letters, she wrote, "One word, war." I watched her draw lines connecting names and dates. Ethan, Linda, Harold, the forged signatures, the insurance, the pension withdrawals. We've got theft, fraud, elder abuse, identity forgery, and medical neglect, she said, ticking them off like ingredients in a recipe. Each one could stand alone in court, but Together, they're an entire ecosystem of exploitation. I leaned forward, tracing one line with my finger. How long would it take? Claire capped her marker and looked at me with the kind of seriousness that only comes from experience. 6 months, maybe 12. Depends on how dirty they play. This isn't a sprint, Sarah. It's a siege. Are you ready for that? I thought about my father sleeping in the next room. His hands trembling when he reached for his coffee that morning, the way he called me Ashy, like I was still a little girl. Yes, I said quietly. I'm ready. Claire nodded. Then first, we make them believe you've given up. They'll relax, get sloppy, maybe even brag. That's when we collect everything. By the end of the day, our war room had taken shape. My dining table was buried under labelled folders, forgeries, transfers, medical records, insurance. The whiteboard on the wall looked like a crime show, prop lines, dates, dollar amounts. I stared at it, feeling both terrified and exhilarated. For the first time, the chaos of my life made sense. Every betrayal had a trail, every lie had a paper behind it. That evening, I made Dad dinner something simple: soup and toast. He was thin and frail, but he ate with quiet gratitude. Afterward, we sat by the window, the rain still tapping gently against the glass. I miss this, he said softly. The sound of peace. You're safe now, I told him, though I wasn't entirely sure it was true. He nodded, eyes half closed, and for a brief moment, I believed it too. Over the next few days, I built a routine around him. Mornings began with coffee and crossword puzzles, afternoons with calls to lawyers, banks, and the few friends I still trusted. Claire came by almost daily. Together, we combed through every record, photographing, scanning, and labelling. My body was still healing, but keeping busy dulled the ache. I was learning to channel my pain into purpose. One night, Claire suggested filing the police report immediately. We have enough, she said. The sooner we act, the sooner he's protected. But I shook my head. If we move now, they'll destroy the rest of the evidence. Linda's smart enough to panic. I need her confident. I need her careless. Claire frowned, but didn't argue. She'd seen this look in me before, the quiet, steady kind of determination that doesn't need approval. Then, what's the first step? I glanced at my phone, scrolling through old texts and photos I hadn't deleted. One thread stood out. Family group chat. Muted. I hadn't looked at it in months. The last message was from Ethan months ago, a photo of his engagement ring captioned, "Finally making Mum proud." I stared at the screen until my reflection blurred into the glass. The first step, I said, is to make them think I've forgiven them. Claire raised an eyebrow. You're going back in not as their victim, I said, as their mirror. That night, I sat on the couch with the phone glowing in my hands, rehearsing the words. My fingers hovered over the keyboard, trembling not with fear, but with the anticipation of control. Then slowly I typed, Mum. I've been thinking about everything. I'm sorry for being difficult. You were right, Ethan deserves this wedding. How can I help? I stared at it for a long time before pressing send. The message looked so harmless, sitting there polite and soft, like the daughter she'd always wanted me to be. My chest tightened, remembering all the times I'd swallowed hurt just to keep the peace, all the birthdays and holidays spent pretending things were fine. But this time, it wasn't surrender. It was strategy. The reply came in seconds. I didn't even have time to put the phone down before it vibrated in my hand. Oh, honey, can you design the reception for free family discount? I felt my jaw tighten. It was so perfectly her asking for more before, offering even a shred of kindness. I typed back slowly, each letter deliberate, my heartbeat steady. Of course, Mum. Anything for family. I hit send, watching the words appear on the screen calm and polite. But as I set the phone down, I whispered to myself, and I meant every word, because this time family wasn't just who I was helping, it was who I was fighting for. The next morning, the mask went on. I stood in front of the mirror, curling my hair, the way my mother liked soft, neat nothing that drew too much attention. I chose a light blue blouse, simple earrings, a smile that looked practiced but harmless. The bruise on my arm from Ethan's last handshake had faded, though the memory hadn't. My stomach still twisted at the thought of seeing them again, but I'd learned to live with that feeling. Fear was just another muscle, one I'd learned to flex without showing it. Claire met me in the parking lot before I drove off. She handed me a small black device no larger than a button. "It's legal in our state," she said quietly. "Just clip it under your collar. It will record everything." I took it, fastening it carefully beneath the fold of my blouse. "You'll have the audio by tonight." "Already set up to back up to the cloud automatically," she said. "You're sure you're ready?" I nodded. "I'm not walking in as their daughter Claire. I'm walking in as their evidence." The drive to my mother's house felt longer than it had in years. The neighbourhood looked the same, but it felt different now, hollow somehow, like the ghosts of every Christmas and birthday we'd spent pretending were happy still lingered in the trees. When I pulled into the driveway, Linda was already standing at the door, waving like I'd just come home from college instead of from surgery and betrayal. "Sarah," she said brightly as I stepped inside. The smell of lemon cleaner hit me like a memory. She hugged me too tightly, and for a moment I almost let myself fall into it. But then I saw the new rug under our old dining table, the fresh vase of roses on the counter, and I remembered none of it was real. "Mum, you look great," I said, forcing warmth into my tone. "You must be so busy with the wedding." "Oh, it's been crazy," she said, laughing in that high performative way she used whenever she wanted to sound important. "But you know me, I thrive on chaos. Ethan says I should have been a wedding planner." "Maybe you missed your calling," I said, setting my bag on the table. "I brought some fabric samples and centerpiece ideas. Thought we could play around with colours." Her eyes lit up greed wrapped in approval. "Oh, honey, that's wonderful. I knew you'd come around." We spent the next hour going through swatches and photos. I asked questions I didn't care about. Floral arrangements, table runners, linen patterns, anything to keep her talking. She loved the sound of her own voice. That was the trick. Keep her comfortable, keep her confident. At one point, as I adjusted the samples on the table, I looked up and said lightly, "Ethan mentioned his new Porsche. It's gorgeous. Business must be booming." Her face brightened instantly. "Oh yes, he's doing so well. You know your father's investment really helped him get off the ground." I tilted my head. "Dad invested." "Well," she said, lowering her voice slightly, "he didn't really understand all the paperwork. Ethan helped him sign everything. He's always been so good with that kind of thing." I smiled, pretending to admire a piece of lace while my heart pounded. "That's so thoughtful of him." She nodded, completely unaware of what she'd just admitted. "We just wanted to make sure everything was secure before your father got, forgetful." I kept my tone even. "Of course. You were protecting him." She looked relieved. "Exactly. Sometimes you just have to take charge for people's own good." I made a mental note of every word, knowing the recorder beneath my collar was capturing it all. Around noon, Ethan's fiancée Melissa arrived. She looked nothing like the woman I'd met years ago at a family dinner. Back then, she was vibrant, confident, always laughing. Now she looked drained, her smile practiced, her posture tense. Her makeup couldn't hide the dark circles under her eyes. "Sarah." "Oh my gosh, it's been forever," she said, hugging me lightly. Her voice trembled. "Too long," I said, returning the smile. "You look busy," she laughed weakly. "You could say that." Linda left us in the kitchen to take a call, and the moment she was gone, Melissa's smile fell away. She leaned closer and whispered, "Can I talk to you for a second?" I nodded, following her out onto the back porch. The air smelled like freshly cut grass, but there was tension in every breath she took. "I don't know how to say this," she began, wringing her hands, "but Ethan's been different lately. He wants me to quit my job after the wedding. Says it's better if I focus on family. He goes through my phone sometimes, gets angry when I meet clients without telling him first." I studied her face. "Melissa, that's not normal. That's control." Her eyes darted to the window. "Please, don't say anything yet. I don't know what to do." I wanted to tell her to run, to pack her things and go, but I could see the fear tightening her shoulders, the same kind of fear I'd lived under for years in that house. Fear disguised as loyalty. So instead I just said, if you ever need help, you call me. Day or night? Understand? She nodded quickly, tears welling up. Thank you. When we went back inside, Linda was still talking loudly on the phone, gesturing dramatically. Melissa disappeared upstairs to check on the caterer files. I excused myself to use the bathroom, partly because I needed a break, partly because I wanted to look around. As I passed Ethan's office, the door was half open. His laptop sat on the desk, screen glowing. I hesitated, then stepped closer. An unsent email filled the screen, subject important reworking with Sarah Mitchell. My stomach dropped as I read the first lines. Warning my sister faked cancer to extort money. Please be careful doing business with her. For a second, I couldn't breathe. The words blurred. He was already preparing to destroy me again, even while pretending we were rebuilding some fragile truce. My pulse pounded so hard I thought it might give me away. I took a photo with my phone, then closed the laptop quietly. When I left the house an hour later, Linda kissed my cheek and handed me a tin of cookies for Dad. I thanked her, smiling like I meant it. Melissa stood in the doorway, her eyes meeting mine for just a second, a silent plea that said she knew more than she could say. That night, as I poured the cookies into the trash, my phone rang. Ethan's name flashed on the screen. I let it ring once, twice before answering. Hey sis, he said, voice dripping with smugness. Thanks for being cool today. Mum said you're finally acting like family. Took you long enough? I smiled into the phone, my voice steady. Yeah, Ethan, it was long overdue. As soon as he hung up, I opened my recorder app, pressed play, and saved the file. Then quietly, I pressed another button back up to cloud. I smiled into the darkness and whispered, Got you. That night, Ethan called me. Thanks for being cool, sis. Mum said you're finally acting like family. Took you long enough. I smiled into the phone and pressed save recording. The next morning, I woke to sunlight slipping through the blinds and the faint sound of my father humming in the kitchen. He'd started doing that again, soft, tuneless, like a man remembering he was still alive. I made coffee for both of us, but my mind wasn't on the quiet morning. It was on Melissa. Her tired eyes, the tremor in her voice, the way she said Ethan checked her phone as if it were normal. I'd seen that kind of control before. It ran in our family like a curse. By noon, I'd texted her. Hey, want to grab lunch? I have some floral sketches for the reception. She responded almost immediately. Yes, please, I need a break. We met at a small cafe halfway between her office and mine. I chose the table near the window, light pouring in like truth. When she arrived, she looked like someone who hadn't slept in days. Her hair was pulled back too tightly, her hand shaking as she set down her purse. She forced a smile. Sorry if I'm a little late. Ethan wanted to review the budget one more time before I left. That's fine, I said gently. You okay? She hesitated, then nodded too quickly. Yeah, just a lot on my plate. We ordered salads neither of us touched. I pulled out a folder with fabric swatches, but she didn't look at them. Her gaze stayed fixed on the condensation forming on her water glass. After a long silence, she said, almost whispering, Can I tell you something and you promise not to tell Ethan? Of course, I said, my heart already tightening. She exhaled shakily. He goes through my phone sometimes. He says it's because he loves me that couples shouldn't keep secrets. He checks who I text, even work stuff. He doesn't like me seeing some of my friends. Says they don't respect him. I forced my voice to stay steady. That's not love, Melissa. That's control. She looked away. He just worries. He says after the wedding I should quit my job so I can focus on the home, the family. He wants me to be peaceful, he calls it. Says I'll thank him later. Her words were quiet, but the shame in them was loud. I recognized it instantly. It was the sound of someone being slowly erased. I reached across the table, touching her wrist. Melissa, you're not crazy for wanting to keep your own life. She nodded, biting her lip. I used to think I could talk him down when he got angry, but lately, he doesn't need a reason. He just gets this look, like he's daring me to argue. For a moment, neither of us spoke. Then she gave a small, bitter laugh. "I'm sorry. You probably think I'm pathetic." "No," I said softly. "I think you're in trouble." She blinked, surprised, as if no one had ever said it out loud. The waiter refilled our waters, and for a moment we both pretended to be two normal women planning a wedding. But Melissa's hands kept twisting in her lap. Finally, she said, "He told me something about your dad. I shouldn't repeat it, but I think it matters." I sat back, letting her talk. "He said your father left everything to him, that you and he had a falling out years ago and that's why you weren't close. He said you were difficult, that you didn't want to be part of the family anymore." I felt the words like a slap, not because they surprised me, but because they fit so perfectly with his pattern. Rewrite the story, isolate the target, make the lies sound like concern. "He told you that?" I asked quietly. She nodded. I believed him. I didn't know what happened between you all. I just thought maybe you two were different. I smiled faintly. "We are different. He takes. I rebuild." She studied my face, then realizing, maybe for the first time, that the story she'd been told didn't add up. "So, it's not true about the inheritance." "Not even close," I said. "But that's a longer conversation." She seemed to want to ask more, but looked down instead. "There's something else," she said. "He had me sign this document a few weeks ago. Said it was for tax purposes, some family asset protection trust. I didn't understand it, but he said all couples with money do it." My pulse quickened. "Do you still have a copy?" "I think so." He emailed it to me. "I can forward it to you." "Do that," I said, trying to keep my tone casual. "Claire, my lawyer friend, she's helping with the design contracts. She can make sure everything's legitimate." Melissa looked relieved. "Thank you. I don't want to mess anything up before the wedding. He gets so upset when I ask too many questions." "Then let me do the asking," I said gently. "You just breathe." After lunch, she hugged me tight, her voice small in my ear. "I'm glad you're back, Sarah. I didn't realize how much I needed someone to talk to. Any time, I said. And I meant it." That evening, I forwarded the document to Claire. 10 minutes later, she called me, her voice sharp. "Sarah, this isn't a tax form, it's a trap." My heart dropped. "What do you mean it's a trust agreement naming Melissa as the beneficiary, but Ethan as the sole trustee?" "That means once they're married, every asset in both their names goes into that trust. But only he can access it. She technically owns nothing." I stared at the glowing computer screen, feeling cold. "So, even her salary, her savings?" "Gone," Claire said. "He'll control it all, legally, and there's a clause that shields the assets from lawsuits. Once it's in the trust, you can't touch it in court even if you win your case against him." The room tilted slightly. "He's building a fortress," I whispered. "Yes," Claire said, "and he's using her name to do it." For a long time, I just sat there listening to my father's slow footsteps in the hallway, the soft creak of the floorboards. Every part of this plan had been years in the making. Linda's manipulation, the forged signatures, now Melissa's trust, it was all one web, and Ethan was in the centre pulling the strings. Claire broke the silence. "We can stop it, but only if we act before the assets transfer. The trust activates the day after the wedding." I looked at the date on the screen. 3 weeks. That was all the time we had. "Can you keep her safe?" Claire asked quietly. "I don't know," I said, standing slowly. "But I can try." Later that night, I stared out the window, the city lights flickering like distant stars. My father's breathing was steady in the next room. I thought about Melissa's shaking hands, her voice, when she said, "He says it's because he loves me." I thought about how easily kindness could be weaponized in the wrong hands. I picked up my notebook and wrote down the names, the dates, the plan forming in my mind. Not just to expose Ethan, but to get Melissa out before he locked her life away for good. I looked at Melissa across the table and realized she's not complicit. She's the next victim. and I had 3 weeks to save her before the wedding. That thought didn't leave me all night. It followed me home into my dreams and was still sitting beside my coffee cup the next morning. 3 weeks wasn't enough time to undo years of deceit, but it was enough to make them stumble. Claire and I had talked through every angle: the forged signatures, the fraudulent trust, the stolen inheritance. But we still lacked one thing that would turn the tide: a confession. Not in whispers or implication, but in writing. Something that showed exactly what they believed they deserved from me. By mid-morning, I had the idea. The kind of idea that comes when you've been underestimated too long. I called Claire. What if I said slowly? I told them I was selling my condo, big profit, fresh start, and as a gesture of family unity, I offered to share the proceeds. There was a pause on the line, then I heard her smile. You'd be baiting their greed. Exactly. They'll think it's reconciliation. But it's documentation. Claire's voice sharpened with approval. Send the invite. Make it sound sincere. I'll draft something they'll sign without blinking. That afternoon, I typed the message. Mum, Ethan, I've been thinking. With the market so strong, I'm selling my condo. Looks like I'll clear around 200k. I want to split it with you both. Fresh start, right? Family is everything. I hit send, then waited. It didn't take long. Ethan replied within 5 minutes. That's incredibly generous, sis. I knew you'd come around. Let's get something written up so it's official. Then came Linda's text, overflowing with exclamation points. Oh, sweetheart, I knew you had such a good heart. We've all been through so much. This means the world to me. I sat back, phone in hand, and whispered to the empty room. Hooked. 2 days later, we met at a cafe near my condo, the same place Ethan liked to show off his Porsche out front. I came prepared, dressed in a soft grey sweater, hair pinned back, the image of composure. Claire had helped me prepare the document. On the surface, it looked like a simple family agreement, confirming our verbal understanding to split the proceeds after closing. But buried in the text was the key, a declaration that they each believed themselves entitled to share in my personal assets as part of our ongoing family financial tradition. A statement that turned greed into written admission. Ethan arrived first crisp suit, that forced grin he wore when he thought he was being charming. You look great, Sarah, he said, kissing the air near my cheek. I'm proud of you for finally realising we're stronger together. Linda swept in moments later, carrying a gift bag, as if this were a celebration. I brought muffins. Your favourite? Blueberry. Thanks, Mum, I said, sitting them down. I really just want to make things right. I've been thinking a lot about Dad, about everything that happened. Maybe sharing this is a way to start over. Ethan leaned forward, eyes gleaming. Absolutely. It's what Dad would have wanted. He always said family should look out for each other. I smiled faintly. Right. So, let's make sure it's clear. Claire helped me draft something, so there's no confusion when the sale closes. I slid the papers across the table. Just a simple acknowledgement. Ethan snatched the pen before Linda even finished skimming the first paragraph. I trust you, sis, always have. He scrawled his name with a flourish, then paused, pulled the pen back and added a note beneath his signature. Looking forward to our fair share finally. ER. Linda hesitated only slightly longer. Oh, this makes me so happy, she said, signing quickly. Your father would be smiling down on us right now. I folded the papers neatly, slipped them back into my folder and smiled. Here's to new beginnings. Ethan raised his coffee. To family. To family, I echoed, my voice, even my pulse, steady. When I got home, Claire was waiting. I handed her the folder, still warm from the cafe table. She read the document once, then again, her eyes widening as she reached the handwritten note. He actually wrote this, Sarah. This is gold. This isn't just arrogance, it's legal suicide. I laughed, tension slipping out of me like air from a balloon. They didn't even read it. Of course not, she said. They think you're back under their spell. That's why this works. She turned to the last page and tapped the signature lines. 2 signatures, 1 confession. You just got them to admit they believe your assets are theirs. That's motive pattern and entitlement in writing. For a moment, we just looked at each other, the weight of what we'd done sinking in. It wasn't triumph. I felt not exactly. More like the deep, steady satisfaction of reclaiming something that was always supposed to be mine. My agency, my power, my truth. The next morning, my phone rang before I'd finished my coffee. "Mum?" I almost didn't answer, but curiosity won. "Sweetheart," she began in that honeyed tone that always preceded a favour. "I've been thinking about that condo money. You know, considering how much we've supported you over the years, helped you with school, took care of you when you were sick, maybe a 60-40 split would be fairer. Don't you think?" I bit back a laugh. 60-40, well, yes, she said, voice turning slightly defensive. It's just, we've always given more, haven't we? It's time that was acknowledged. I stared at the wall, imagining Claire's face when I told her. "Sure, Mum," I said lightly. "Let me think about it." When the call ended, I checked the recorder app still running on my phone. Every word was there. Her tone, her phrasing, her assumption that my success was somehow owed to them. That evening, I met Claire at her office. The city lights glowed behind her as she reviewed the recording. When it finished, she leaned back, eyes shining. "Perfect," she said, a verbal confirmation of entitlement right after a written one. They just walked straight into the trap. I smiled a slow, tired smile. They always do when they think they're winning. Claire lifted the signed document between her fingers like a trophy. They just admitted in writing that they've been taking from you for years and feel entitled to more. Gold. Her words stayed with me through the week. Every night I replayed them in my head as I watched my father fall asleep in the recliner, a blanket pulled up to his chest. The document sat in a folder on my desk next to a flash drive filled with recordings and screenshots. Piece by piece, the puzzle was taking shape. But there was one final piece missing, something live, undeniable, the kind of evidence no one could explain away. And I knew exactly how to get it. On Friday morning, Linda texted me. "Family dinner. Sunday. Just us. Let's make peace before the wedding. Bring your father." I stared at the screen, feeling the faint tremor of adrenaline under my skin. A family healing dinner. It was too perfect to be coincidence. They wanted a show of unity before the wedding, maybe even to parade their control one last time. They didn't know, they'd just given me my stage. When I told Claire, she didn't hesitate. "You're wearing a wire," she said simply. "It's one-party consent in this state. Everything they say is admissible." That Sunday, I stood in front of my mirror, pinning the small recording device inside my blazer. My reflection looked calm, but inside my heart was beating with steady precision. This wasn't revenge anymore. It was preservation. I wasn't just protecting myself, I was protecting my father, Melissa, and anyone else they might try to consume next. The drive to my mother's house felt longer than usual, every familiar tree along the road reminding me of how small I'd once felt here. When we arrived, I helped my father out of the car. He was thinner now, but his grip on my arm was strong. "You sure you want to do this?" he asked softly. I nodded. "It's time, Dad." Linda met us at the door, radiant and overdone in a way that always meant she was performing. "Oh, this feels so right," she said, kissing my cheek. Family together again. Her perfume clung to the air, heavy and artificial. The table was set for 4. Candles flickered. Roast chicken, green beans, and the faint sound of jazz filled the silence that always came before something ugly. Ethan arrived last dressed as if for a business dinner, not a family meal. He clapped me on the shoulder. "You look good, sis. Healthy." "I am," I said evenly. "Thanks for noticing." Dinner began politely enough. Linda passed the rolls Ethan bragged about his firm, and my father sat quietly pushing food around his plate. I waited, letting the conversation flow. When Ethan mentioned a new client, I leaned in voice light. "You've done so well, Ethan. Dad must be proud. He told me he helped get you started. Ethan's grin widened. Yeah, those first investments made all the difference. I wouldn't have this firm without Dad's guidance. I turned slightly toward my father. Cash or assets, Dad. Which did you invest? He looked up from his plate, eyes clouded. I don't remember signing anything. For a moment the room went still. Then Linda's smile stiffened. Harold, don't start that again, she said quickly. You're confused. Remember what Dr. Sharma said about your memory? I set down my fork, voice steady. Dr. Sharma, that's interesting, Mum. Because Dad hasn't seen him in 8 months. Linda blinked, the colour rising in her face. That's not true. I took him myself just last month. I kept my tone calm, almost curious. I called Sharma's office last week. They said all of Dad's appointments for the past year were cancelled by a family member. The silence that followed was absolute. Ethan froze with his wine glass halfway to his lips. My father's hand trembled slightly on the table. Then came the sound of metal against porcelain, Linda's fork slipping from her hand and clattering onto her plate. I don't know what you're talking about, she stammered, voice tight. You must have misunderstood. I met her gaze unblinking. I understood perfectly. You told his doctor to stop calling. You didn't want me to know how bad things had gotten. You needed him quiet while you moved everything into Ethan's name. Her mouth opened, but no words came out. The air in the room shifted, something fragile cracking in the silence. Ethan finally spoke, his tone defensive. You don't know what you're accusing us of. Dad agreed to everything. My father looked up, then slow, but certain. No, he said quietly. I didn't. Linda reached for his hand. Harold, sweetheart, don't upset yourself. You're remembering it wrong. You've been under so much stress. He pulled his hand away. His eyes, usually fogged with fatigue, were sharp now. No, Linda, not this time. I sat perfectly still, my heart hammering in my chest. The tiny device beneath my blazer recording every word, every tremor in their voices. For a second, I almost forgot to breathe. Ethan shifted in his seat, trying to recover control. Look, this is getting ridiculous. We came here for peace, not accusations. Sarah's just twisting things again like she always does. I turned to him, my tone measured. Then, you won't mind if I ask something simple. Why did you forge Dad's signature on the pension transfer form? His head snapped toward me. What? Linda gasped. Sarah, that's outrageous. Claire traced it, I said evenly. The handwriting, the timestamp, even the IP address. You used your office computer. But we can talk about that later. Ethan's face flushed red. You're bluffing. I tilted my head slightly. Try me. The silence stretched again, heavy, suffocating. My father's breathing grew shallow, and I reached to steady his hand. That simple gesture seemed to pull something inside him, taught years of silence, guilt and helplessness coiling into something new, resolve. Then Harold stood up, frail, but clear-eyed, and said the words that changed everything. Linda, tell them what you did. Tell them now, or I will. The room froze. Even the sound of the clock ticking seemed to stop. Linda's face drained of colour, her hand gripping the edge of the table for balance. Ethan's fork hovered halfway between his plate and his mouth, his mask of confidence slipping just enough to show the fear beneath. My heart pounded, but I stayed still, knowing this moment wasn't mine to lead. It was his. My father's voice trembled, but it carried more strength than I'd heard in years. You think I don't remember? He began slowly, his eyes fixed on Linda. You think the pills and the papers and the quiet rooms made me forget. But I remember enough. Linda's voice was sharp, desperate. Harold, please, you're confused. He shook his head, his hands trembling but steadying on the back of his chair. No, not confused. Not anymore. You brought me papers I didn't understand, said it was for taxes, said Ethan would handle things for us. I didn't want to sign, but you told me Sarah would be fine, that she didn't need me. Ethan stood abruptly. Dad, that's not what happened. You were sick. We were just trying to help. Harold's gaze snapped to him, the softness in his eyes replaced by fire. Help you brought those papers, Ethan. You and your mother. You said it was about protecting the family business. I remember you sitting in my study practicing Sarah's signature in that blue notebook from college. I didn't say anything then. I wanted to believe you'd do the right thing. Ethan's voice cracked with anger. You're remembering wrong. That's ridiculous. Well, enough. My father's voice roared the word, shaking the air. For a second, he looked 10 years younger. Taller somehow, his shoulders straightening as if he'd been waiting his whole life to speak this truth. You cancelled my insurance. You moved my accounts. You told Sarah I didn't want to see her, told me she'd given up on me. And I believed you. His voice broke, but he kept going. You took everything from me, my home, my name, my peace. And you tried to take her too. Linda covered her mouth, her eyes glistening. Harold, stop. You're going to make yourself sick. He ignored her. His voice softened when he turned toward me. Sarah, there's something I should have told you a long time ago. My throat tightened. Dad, you don't have to, I do, he said. I was your anonymous donor, the one who paid for your surgery. I sold my car, my golf clubs, even my father's watch. Because you matter more than things, more than their greed. The world seemed to tilt for a moment. I couldn't speak. I could only stare at him, the man who had been silenced and dismissed for years now, standing in the middle of the dining room like a soldier, who'd finally come home from a war no one believed he'd fought. Linda's chair scraped loudly as she stood. You've just destroyed your son's life, Harold, she said coldly. I hope you're proud of yourself. Don't you dare put that on him, I said quietly, rising to my feet. He's done enough protecting you. It ends tonight. Ethan slammed his palm on the table. You're twisting everything, Sarah. You always do. You want to make us look like monsters so you can play the victim again. My father's voice cut through his words like a blade. She doesn't have to make you look like anything. You did that yourself. For the first time, Ethan's eyes darted away. He turned to his mother, but she was already gathering her purse, her movements sharp and unsteady. Come on, Ethan, she said through clenched teeth. We're leaving. He hesitated. Mom, now, she hissed. They walked out together, their shadows stretching long across the floor before the door closed behind them. The silence that followed was heavier than any noise could have been. My father's hand trembled as he reached for his glass of water. I took it from him and set it down before he could spill it. For a long moment, neither of us spoke. The candlelight flickered between us, and I realised my recorder was still running quietly, capturing the sound of his breathing, his confession the truth. He sank slowly back into his chair, eyes wet but clear. I should have stopped them sooner, he whispered. I should have believed you. I knelt beside him, taking his hand. You did more than I ever expected, Dad. You told the truth. That's everything. He nodded faintly, his lips trembling. You were always the strong one. I just forgot to see it. I pressed his hand to my chest, feeling the faint rhythm of his pulse beneath my fingers. You see it now. For a long time, we sat there, the two of us surrounded by the ruins of what had once been a family dinner. The plates were cold, the candles nearly gone. Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the windows, like an echo of everything that had been broken inside these walls. But for the first time, I didn't feel powerless. The fear, the anger, the years of silence, they all seemed smaller now. Claire would tell me later that the recording from that night was perfect, clear, complete, and devastating. But in that moment, I didn't care about evidence or lawsuits or even justice. All I cared about was the weight of my father's hand in mine and the way he looked at me, not with guilt or confusion, but with pride. When he finally spoke again, his voice was soft. You know, I always thought money kept families together. Turns out it just shows you who they really are. I smiled through the tears I hadn't realised were falling. Then maybe we finally get to start over the two of us. He squeezed my hand, his fingers weak but sure. We already have. For the first time in my life, Dad held my hand and didn't let go. and I realised I'd already won something more important than money. The next morning, I woke before sunrise. The house was quiet except for the sound of my father's breathing in the next room. I poured myself a cup of coffee and sat by the window watching the sky shift from grey to pale gold. The light felt different that morning, cleaner somehow, like it belonged to a new world. But I knew peace would have to wait. The truth was finally out, and now it needed to become action. When Claire arrived, she didn't bother with small talk. She placed a leather briefcase on the table, opened it, and spread out the documents like a general preparing for battle. "We're filing both," she said, "civil and criminal. The DA's office already confirmed they will open an investigation once we submit the evidence. We'll start with elder abuse, identity theft, and financial exploitation. The forged will and signature practice notes seal the deal." I took a slow breath. "You really think it'll stick?" She looked up steady and certain. "It'll do more than stick. They'll crumble." By 9 o'clock, the filings were submitted. 2 hours later, the county courthouse stamped both cases as received. The official case numbers looked strangely small on paper, given how large this moment felt. I stared at them until my vision blurred. For years, I had lived under the quiet weight of their manipulation. Now that weight was on record under law. The fallout started faster than anyone expected. Small towns have a way of spreading news before the ink dries. By afternoon, whispers had already turned into headlines. Local businessman under investigation for family fraud. My phone buzzed endlessly. Some messages were from old classmates offering sympathy, others from people I barely remembered, suddenly eager to share what they always suspected about Linda and Ethan. But the call that mattered came from Marcus, Ethan's business partner. His voice was tight but calm. "Sarah, I just got off the phone with my attorney. I had no idea about the fraud, about your father's accounts. I'm dissolving the partnership effective immediately. I can't be tied to this." I leaned back in my chair, closing my eyes. "I understand, Marcus. I'm not calling for revenge. I just want this to end." He sighed. "It already has, at least for Ethan." That afternoon, I found myself watching the small ripples of consequence spread outward. By evening, the country club had temporarily suspended Linda's membership pending investigation. The official statement said it was a routine compliance review, but everyone knew what it meant. A friend from town texted me a photo of Linda sitting alone in her car outside the club gates, her manicured hand covering her face. I didn't feel joy exactly, just a deep, quiet justice. For years, she'd built her world on appearances, membership cards, charity luncheons, polished lies. Now that world was unraveling in public strand by strand. Meanwhile, Ethan went silent. No texts, no calls, no public posts. But silence doesn't stay still for long. A week after the filing, a reporter showed up outside my building asking for comment. I didn't answer. I didn't need to. The documents spoke louder than anything I could say. 2 days later, Claire called with another update. The DA's office froze their joint accounts pending review. The pension transfers are locked, and the fake trust is being audited. They can't touch a dime without scrutiny. "Good," I said quietly. Then it's finally their turn to worry about bills. And bills came fast. The first real crack in their new facade came from the wedding venue. I was in my studio late one night when I got a copy of an email forwarded from one of my contacts at the design firm that handled their bookings. The subject line read "Urgent Payment Deadline. Notice." The venue required full payment $80,000 2 weeks before the event. A new policy, they said, for high-risk clientele. Linda had already paid half, but the rest was due immediately. The funds, of course, were frozen under investigation. Claire smiled when she read it. "They can't pay without admitting the source of the money was your father's accounts. If they try, they'll incriminate themselves." I tried not to laugh, but the irony was too sharp to ignore. The very greed that had driven them now left them paralysed. In the middle of all that chaos, my own life began to heal. Slowly, quietly, like a wound closing after too long. The medical debt was still there, but For the first time, I could see a path through it. When my story started to circulate, stripped of gossip, told honestly, something unexpected happened. Clients began calling again. Not out of pity, but out of respect. One of them, a woman named Karen, who'd cancelled her contract months earlier, left me a message. "You don't owe anyone an apology, Sarah. People like you remind the rest of us that standing up matters. I want you to finish my project." By the end of 3 months, my small design business had stabilised. By 6, I hired my first employee, a quiet, kind woman named Beth, who reminded me of myself 10 years earlier, before the weight of family expectation had settled on my shoulders. Even Dad seemed lighter. He started walking every morning, humming as he went. Sometimes he'd stop by my studio with sandwiches, or just to sit and watch me work. "Looks like you're finally living," he'd say, half smiling. I was. For the first time in years, I was living without apology. But peace is a fragile thing. It lasts right up until the phone rings. It was late on a Friday afternoon, the sun low, the light warm on my desk. I almost didn't answer when I saw Melissa's name flash across the screen. When I did, her voice was trembling. "Sarah, I need your help," she said. "Ethan just asked me to wire him $50,000 from my savings. He says it's temporary. But after what you told me, I'm scared." Her words hit me with the quiet, sinking weight of inevitability. I could hear the panic beneath her controlled tone, the sound of someone realising the ground under them was not solid after all. I told her to meet me at the coffee shop on Main, the same one where we'd first talked about floral arrangements and seating charts. This time, there would be no talk of weddings. When I arrived, she was already there, hunched over a mug she wasn't drinking from. Her phone lay face down on the table, as if she couldn't bear to look at it. The light from the window caught the faint swelling under her eyes, evidence of a sleepless night. "Melissa," I said softly as I sat down. "What happened?" She didn't look up right away. "It's getting worse," she said finally. "Since the investigation started, he's been different. He checks my messages, my call history. He says it's for my safety. He has my passwords now, all of them. My phone, my email, even my bank app. He says I'm too trusting with people." She gave a small hollow laugh. "He says that's one of the reasons he loves me." My hands tightened around my cup. "That's not love, Melissa. That's control." She nodded, tears threatening to spill, but refusing to fall. "I know. I just don't know what to do. He says the money's for the business, that everything's frozen because of what you did. He said you're trying to ruin him. He's trying to use you to stay afloat," I said carefully. "And once you give him access to your savings, he'll use that too." She wiped her eyes quickly, as if embarrassed. "I thought when we got engaged things would calm down. He promised he'd stop checking my messages. But it's like the closer the wedding gets, the smaller my world becomes. My friend stopped calling because he reads everything. My parents are confused because he insists on speaking for both of us." "Melissa," I said quietly, "he's isolating you." She looked up then, her eyes red-rimmed but clear. "I thought that word only applied to women who were hit or screamed at. But he doesn't yell. He just decides for me. And when I question it, he looks at me like I'm being ungrateful." Before I could respond, Claire walked in. I had asked her to join us, knowing we needed more than comfort now. Melissa straightened, startled but relieved when I introduced her. Claire gave a kind smile, then set a folder on the table. "I brought the trust document you forwarded last month," she said. "I think it's time we talk about what it really means." Melissa's voice was small. I didn't read it. I just signed because he said it was normal. Claire opened the folder, smoothing out the pages. "It's called the Family Asset Protection Trust. Sounds safe, right? But this clause here," she pointed to a line halfway down, "gives Ethan full control. You're listed as the beneficiary, but that doesn't mean what you think it does. He's the trustee. He can withdraw funds for family needs, which he defines. You can't contest his decisions without his written permission." Melissa stared at her, stunned. "You mean I'd have no access to my own money?" None, Claire said gently. If you marry him, every paycheck, every asset in your name becomes part of the trust. And because of how it's structured, even if he's convicted of fraud, you can't legally separate your funds without his approval. Her lip trembled. He said it was just paperwork for taxes. That's how predators talk, I said quietly. They use the language of trust to build cages. Melissa closed her eyes, pressing her palms against her forehead. Oh, God, she whispered. What have I done? I leaned forward, touching her hand. You haven't done anything wrong. You believed someone you loved. That's not a crime. But now you know, so you get to choose what happens next. She looked at me then, searching my face for something, permission maybe, or courage. What do I even say to him? The wedding's in 2 weeks. Invitations went out. My parents already paid for half of it. If I cancel now, everyone will think I'm crazy. Melissa, I said softly, you can't live your life to protect other people's expectations. Do you want to marry him? Really? Her breath caught the question, hanging in the air like something fragile. I don't know anymore, she said finally. I thought I did, but now I feel like I don't even know who he is, who I am, when I'm with him. I gave her hand a squeeze. Then maybe that's your answer. We sat there in silence for a while, the hum of the espresso machine filling the spaces where words couldn't go. Claire gathered the papers back into the folder, her eyes kind but firm. You still have time to protect yourself, she said. But not much. Every day you wait gives him another chance to tighten his grip. That evening, I stayed near my phone, unable to focus on anything else. Around 9, it buzzed with a text from Melissa. I told him it's over. I said I need space. I said I won't sign anything else. My heart lifted, pride and fear tangled together. How did he take it? I typed back. A minute passed before the 3 dots appeared, then vanished, then appeared again. He didn't yell. He just stared at me. Then he left. I locked the door. I'm shaking. You did the right thing, I wrote. I'm proud of you. Stay safe. Call me if anything happens. She didn't reply. I waited another hour pacing the apartment until the message tone startled me. It wasn't from her, it was a voicemail she forwarded. I pressed play and Ethan's voice filled the room, low and controlled in a way that was somehow worse than shouting. You've been talking to Sarah, haven't you? He said. You're both going to regret this. I promise you that. That voicemail echoed in my head long after the message ended. I played it twice just to be sure I'd heard the tone. Right, not shouting, not manic, but cold, calculated. The kind of voice that didn't make empty threats. I forwarded the file to Claire and deleted it from my phone. Not because I wanted to forget, but because I couldn't bear to see his name flash across my screen again. For the next few days, I stayed cautious. I kept my blinds drawn, double-checked the locks, even parked my car closer to the entrance of my building. Melissa had gone quiet too. Claire said she was staying with a friend out of town and I didn't ask where. It was better that way. The less Ethan knew, the safer she'd be. By Friday night, I almost convinced myself the worst was over. The investigation had frozen his assets, the wedding was cancelled, and every business partner he'd had was running for the door. Maybe he'd finally realised it was over. I remember thinking that exact thought when I heard the first knock. It was just past 10. I wasn't expecting anyone. The sound came again louder this time, 3 hard raps that made my heart skip. I moved to the door, checked the peephole and froze. Ethan stood there, swaying slightly, a half-empty bottle in one hand, his face red and slick with sweat. I didn't open the door. Ethan, go home, I said through the wood. He laughed, a short broken sound. Home, you took my home, Sarah. You took everything. My pulse quickened. You're drunk. Leave before I call the police. His hand hit the door, rattling it in its frame. You destroyed my life, he shouted. Melissa's gone. My business is tanking the weddings off. You think you can walk away after doing this to me? I grabbed my phone and started recording. My thumb hovered over the emergency dial. I didn't do this, Ethan. You did. You lied. You stole. You hurt people. This is what happens when the truth catches up. He laughed, again slurred and ugly. No one will believe you. You're the crazy sister who needed money. the one who faked being sick to get attention. You're just angry because Mum finally saw through you. I have proof, I said, forcing my voice to stay steady. Everything you've done is documented. He stepped closer, his voice dropping to a snarl. You always thought you were smarter than everyone. But this time, Sarah, you went too far. You're going to regret this. I could smell the alcohol even through the door. My hand was shaking, but I kept recording. I'm calling the police, I said. That was when the door burst open. The chain snapped off the latch, the wood splintered, and suddenly he was inside, unsteady but fast. I stumbled back, hitting the edge of the table. He grabbed my arm before I could move his fingers, digging hard into my skin. You think you can ruin me? He spat, his breath hot and sour. You don't get to win. Let go, Ethan, I shouted, twisting, trying to pull free. He tightened his grip, leaving me gasping. Pain shot up my arm. Somewhere outside, I heard a door open. Mrs. Patterson's voice muffled through the hallway. Sarah, is everything all right? Ethan froze, his eyes flicking toward the door. For a moment, I saw something flicker in him. Not guilt, just fear of being seen. This isn't over, he hissed and shoved me back. My phone clattered to the floor, still recording. Then, he stumbled toward the hallway just as Mrs. Patterson called again, louder this time. By the time I reached the door, she was standing in her robe, phone in hand. I called the police, she said, eyes wide. I heard him yelling. I could only nod. My arm throbbed where he'd grabbed me, a deep bruise already blooming beneath the skin. The police arrived within minutes, 2 officers calm but firm. They found Ethan sitting on the steps outside the bottle, empty beside him. When they asked what happened, he tried to smile, slurring his words. Just a misunderstanding. Family stuff. But when they saw my arm, the splintered door, and heard the recording still running on my phone, the tone changed. They handcuffed him right there, his protest fading into the hum of the patrol car engine. I watched through the window. As they drove him away, lights flashing red and blue against the dark street. Mrs. Patterson stood beside me, her hand light on my shoulder. You're safe now, she said softly. I wanted to believe her. The officers stayed long enough to take my statement. They called out a repair service to secure the door and told me Ethan would be charged with trespassing and the simple assault. He'll spend the night in holding, one of them said. You'll get a call in the morning about the arraignment, and we'll make sure there is a restraining order in place before he's released. When they left, the silence was almost unbearable. I sat on the couch staring at the broken latch, the dark scuff marks where his shoes had slid across the floor. The recording on my phone ended with my own voice shaking but clear. You don't get to win. It took hours before my heartbeat slowed enough for me to sleep. When I finally drifted off, I dreamed of doors slamming and footsteps running down endless hallways. The next morning, Claire called. He's out on bail, she said grimly. The restraining order's active, but stay alert. People like him don't let go easily. I'll be careful, I promised. My voice sounded steadier than I felt. After we hung up, I checked the bruise on my arm. It had darkened overnight, purple and green against my skin, a souvenir of how far he'd fallen and how close he'd come. I told myself it was over now. The law was involved, the restraining order was in place, and he couldn't touch me again. For the first time in months, I almost let myself relax. What I didn't know was that Ethan had made a phone call from jail to someone who specialised in making problems disappear. A week passed before I felt the first ripple of that call. Life had fallen into a fragile routine again, morning coffee with Dad, evening check-ins with Claire, and long walks meant to calm the edges of my nerves. The bruises on my arm had faded, but the sense of unease lingered like a shadow I couldn't shake. Every time the phone rang, my chest tightened. I told myself Ethan couldn't touch us now. The restraining order, the charges, the scrutiny, all of it should have been enough. Then Frank called. Frank O'Donnell had served with my dad decades ago. A retired cop he'd been stopping by weekly since Harold moved in with me, bringing groceries and stories from their Navy days. His voice was calm but sharp that morning. Sarah, he said, you need to listen carefully. I was at your dad's house yesterday, cutting the grass, making sure the place still looks lived in. Some guy was parked across the street taking photos. Not the casual kind either. Professional camera long lens. He left fast when I waved. My heart started to race. Maybe it was someone from the real estate office, I offered weakly. No, Frank said flatly. I ran the plate. Old habits die hard. The name that came back Lester Boyd. He's got priors for arson. 3 counts. Did time in state prison. You should call your detective now. Within an hour, I was sitting in the police station again, my hands cold despite the heat. Detective Ramos listened carefully as I relayed what Frank had said, jotting down notes. When I mentioned the license plate, his expression hardened. We know that name, he said. Boyd's been on probation for less than a year. If he's near your father's property, that's no coincidence. They pulled Boyd's phone records within 24 hours. What they found made my blood run cold. A string of text messages between Boyd and a number registered under Ethan's business account. The last one was dated 3 days earlier. It read, I need that property problem solved. Cash waiting. The kind that looks like an accident. Electrical. The detective turned the screen toward me. I think your brother just tried to burn down your father's house, he said quietly. I couldn't speak for a moment. It wasn't just anger this time, it was disbelief. Grief, something hollow and aching that no amount of justice could fill. He wanted to erase everything I whispered, every trace of Dad's name. Ramos nodded grimly. We're getting a warrant now. He won't see this one coming. The arrest happened that evening. Ethan was taken from his apartment in handcuffs this time, without the chance to make excuses. The additional charges, conspiracy to commit arson and attempted insurance fraud, were serious enough that the DA filed a motion to deny standard bail. His new hearing was scheduled for Monday, with his bond set at an amount so high even Linda couldn't hope to post it. By morning, the story had broken. Prominent family accused of elder abuse, arson plot. The headline was everywhere, local TV, online news, even the regional paper that once ran my mother's charity photos. Reporters camped outside the courthouse, microphones ready, waiting for anyone connected to the case to comment. Claire warned me not to respond publicly, but that didn't stop people from reaching out privately. My phone lit up, constantly texts from old friends, business contacts, even strangers. Some messages were kind. You're brave. Keep standing up. Others were curious, even ghoulish. Did he really try to burn down your house? But one call stood out. Marcus, Ethan's former business partner, his voice tight with restrained fury. I knew he was ambitious, he said, but I didn't think he was dangerous. Clients are calling, asking for refunds. They're sharing stories. He forged signatures on contracts, Sarah. I didn't see it before, but now it's clear. He built everything on lies. Each call, each headline was like watching a tower crumble one floor at a time. The same people who once praised Ethan's drive and Linda's charm were now lining up to distance themselves. The facade that had taken them decades to build was finally collapsing. That night, I sat in the living room with Dad. He'd been quiet most of the day, processing the news, in his own slow, thoughtful way. Finally, he said, he was always chasing something that wasn't real. Maybe now he'll finally stop running. I looked at him across the dim room, the soft light from the lamp catching the lines on his face. You think people like him ever stop, he sighed. Maybe not, but they eventually run out of places to hide. I wished I could believe that, but deep down, I knew Ethan wasn't the kind of man who surrendered easily. He'd already proven how far he would go to destroy what he couldn't control. The only comfort was knowing that this time he wasn't the only one with a voice. People were talking, witnesses were stepping forward. The truth was spreading faster than any of his lies ever had. The following day, a local reporter requested an interview. I declined, but she emailed me her article draft anyway. The headline read, Community Rallies Around Sarah Reed After Family Scandal. There were quotes from clients, neighbours, even Frank. He'd told her, she's tougher than she looks. Some people stand up once and fall back down. Sarah. She stands up and stays there, reading that I felt something I hadn't felt in a long time, pride. Not in winning, but in surviving without bitterness. The community that had once looked the other way now stood beside me. And for the first time since this began, I believed maybe there was a way forward. Still, when the house grew quiet again and the night settled in, that old unease crept back. Justice had its own kind of loneliness. Claire had warned me early on that once you expose the truth, it never stops rippling. People will start asking for forgiveness, she'd said. But not all of them deserve it. She was right. That night, after Dad went to bed, I sat at my desk, scrolling through the day's flood of messages. My inbox was overflowing congratulations, questions, sympathy, and a few cruel remarks from people who thought family loyalty should outweigh truth. I was about to close my laptop when a new email appeared. The sender's name made my stomach twist. Linda Reed. The subject line was one word. Please. I stared at it for an hour before opening it. The house was silent except for the faint hum of the refrigerator and the sound of the clock ticking above the stove. Dad had gone to bed early, and Claire had told me to take the weekend to rest to breathe before the next wave. But there was no rest in me. That single word, please, had been sitting in my inbox, like a weight pressing on my chest until I couldn't ignore it any longer. When I finally clicked the email open, it was longer than I expected. Pages of text, carefully written the way my mother always wrote when she wanted to sound reasonable. The kind of tone she used in holiday letters to relatives when she wanted to pretend everything was fine. The first paragraph was defensive. She blamed the news, the gossip, the way outsiders had twisted our family's story. She said I was being used, manipulated by lawyers and so-called friends who didn't understand that family business should stay in the family. I could almost hear her voice as I read, calm, measured, but trembling beneath the surface. Then the tone shifted. She began to explain herself, though she would never call it that. You don't understand what it's like to have a child who almost dies, she wrote. Ethan came into this world 2 months early. He was so small, Sarah. He fit into my hands like a doll. The doctors said he might not make it. And when he finally breathed on his own, I promised God I'd protect him no matter what. He was my miracle. I couldn't lose him. I felt something inside me twist. I remembered the family stories, the way Mum would retell the night of Ethan's birth every Christmas, how she stayed awake in the hospital, praying, how Dad drove home in the snow to fetch her Bible. But she never told me it was the night she made that vow. Reading it now, I realised that was the beginning of everything, the seed of a love so fierce it turned blind. Maybe I held on too tight, she continued. Maybe I made him weak, but he was always fragile, sensitive. He needed more from me than you ever did. You were strong, Sarah, independent. You didn't need me, and I suppose I stopped trying. I only wanted to protect him from a world that's cruel to boys who fail. Is that so terrible? I read that line 3 times. The world is cruel to boys who fail. As if that excused everything. As if the world owed Ethan gentleness at the expense of everyone else's pain. But the part that came next was worse. It wasn't written in anger. It was written in something colder. If you don't drop the charges, she wrote, you'll destroy your brother. He'll go to prison. You think you're saving your father, but you're sentencing your brother. Can you live with that? Can you look in the mirror knowing you chose revenge over mercy? The words blurred as I read them. It wasn't just manipulation. It was the same moral sleight of hand she'd always used. She'd twisted right and wrong until guilt looked like virtue and silence looked like peace. She'd done it when we were kids, when Ethan lied, when I got blamed, when she said, let's not make a scene, Sarah. Now she was doing it again, except the stakes were no longer broken toys or missed curfews. Now it was crimes, lives, truth. By the time I reached the end, I was shaking. Her final sentence hit harder than any of it. If you do this, you'll lose what's left of this family. There will be no coming back. I sat there for a long time, the glow of the screen washing over me. I wasn't angry. Not really. What I felt was something quieter, an ache that came from seeing finally and fully that she would never change. My mother wasn't evil. She was broken in a way that couldn't be repaired. She couldn't love two children at once without taking from one to feed the other. She couldn't hold guilt and love in the same breath. And for years, I had been trying to make her see what she refused to see. When I finally cried, it wasn't out of confusion. It was because I understood her too well. After a while, I wiped my eyes, opened a new message and began to type. Mum, I wrote, I love you, I always have. But love doesn't mean accepting abuse. It doesn't mean staying silent when people are hurt. Ethan made choices, and those choices have consequences. I didn't destroy him. I didn't make him steal or lie or threaten anyone. He did that. I'm not dropping the charges. I paused before writing the last line. I hope someday you'll go understand. But even if you don't, I need to live in the truth. That's all I've ever wanted. I read it twice, made sure it said exactly what I meant, firm, but not cruel, and pressed. Send. The reply came 20 minutes later. Short. Cold. Then you're no daughter of mine. I stared at those words until the edges of the screen seemed to fade. My first instinct was to delete the message, to erase the final cut. But I didn't. I closed the laptop instead and sat there in the dark, letting the weight of what she'd said settle around me. Dad came out once half asleep, asking if I was all right. I told him I was fine, and sent him back to bed. Then I made tea. I didn't drink, walked the length of the living room 12 times, and finally sat by the window, looking out at the quiet street below. For so long I had been fighting to earn something from her, a kind of fairness, a kind of love that saw me, not just tolerated me. But now I realized I'd been chasing something that never existed. She didn't disown me tonight. She just said aloud what had always been true. The tears came slowly this time, soft and steady, without anger or regret. They felt like something washing clean, not breaking down. I cried for an hour after reading that, not because she disowned me, but because I finally felt free. 9 months passed before the court hearing. 9 months of filing statements, depositions, and the slow grind of a system that promised justice, but never in a hurry. By the time the hearing was scheduled, I had stopped dreaming about quick resolutions. I only wanted truth to stand on the record, carved into something that couldn't be twisted or denied. It was early spring when the notice arrived. The courthouse date was set for a Monday morning. Claire called that same day and said simply, "It's time." I could hear in her voice what she didn't say aloud, that this case had become more than work for her. It was personal now, as it was for me. Dad was too frail to attend in person. His health had declined in the winter, and though he tried to hide it, I saw the way his hands trembled when he held a cup of tea, the way his words sometimes drifted away before the thought was done. But when I told him the hearing was coming, his eyes sharpened and he said, "We've waited long enough. Let's finish it." The morning of the hearing, I arrived at the courthouse with Claire and Frank, who had insisted on coming. He sat quietly in the back row, his posture straight as ever, like a sentry keeping watch. The courtroom was smaller than I expected, lined with dark wood and sunlight that filtered through high windows. The air smelled faintly of paper and old polish. Linda sat across the aisle with her attorney, dressed in a pale blue suit, her hair perfectly styled. Her face looked tight exhausted, but her eyes darted toward me only once before dropping to the table. Ethan sat beside her, his wrists cuffed loosely before the bailiff removed them. He looked thinner, older, as though the months of legal strain had finally shown. But his expression held the same defiance, the same cold certainty that somehow even now he could talk his way out. When the judge entered the room, stilled. Judge Hamilton was a woman in her 60s with a reputation for being meticulous, fair and utterly unswayed by theatrics. She opened the file before her, flipping through pages slowly before speaking. "This is the matter of Reed Vice Reed. The court will now review evidence pertaining to allegations of undue influence, financial exploitation and forgery regarding the will and estate of Mr. Harold Reed. I took a breath. Claire's hand brushed mine briefly, a silent reminder that I wasn't alone. The hearing began with the evidence presentation. Claire spoke first methodically, walking through the bank records tracing every withdrawal that had been made after the forged will. She showed copies of Ethan's electronic transfers, the signature overlays, the mismatched ink dates. The forensic handwriting expert took the stand next his calm voice, explaining the analysis. The signature attributed to Harold Reed on the revised will is not consistent with his known writing samples. There are tremor lines indicative of tracing hesitation marks and 2 unique letter formations identical to samples of Ethan Reed's own handwriting. Ethan's lawyer objected, but the judge overruled him. Next came the medical documentation. Claire submitted the reports from Dad's neurologist confirming mild cognitive impairment at the time the new will was allegedly signed. The doctor's letter was clear. Harold Reed would not have been able to fully understand or consent to complex legal documents without independent counsel. And then came the video. The clerk wheeled in, a monitor, adjusted the volume and pressed play. The screen flickered to life, showing my father sitting in his armchair, his voice thin but steady. His lawyer had recorded the deposition weeks earlier. The judge's voice came from off-screen. "Mr. Reed, did you intend to disinherit your daughter, Sarah Reed?" Dad looked straight into the camera. His lips trembled as he spoke. "Never," he said softly. "Sarah is my heart. They lied to me. They said she didn't want to see me anymore, that she'd moved on with her life. I believed them for a while. I was ashamed for believing it." His voice broke, and he paused, breathing carefully before continuing. "I didn't sign that paper on my own. I didn't even know what it was. They said it was insurance paperwork. I just wanted to rest. I didn't know they were taking her name off my will." When the video ended, the room was silent, except for the faint hum of the speakers. The judge's eyes lingered on the screen a moment longer before she turned back to her notes. Linda's attorney spoke next, his arguments mechanical and empty. He claimed confusion, misunderstanding, even misplaced paperwork. But his words fell flat in the shadow of my father's testimony. Linda stared at her hands, refusing to look up. Ethan, on the other hand, glared at the judge, jaw tight, every inch of him radiating fury. When both sides finished, the judge took a long pause, her fingers steepled before her. Then she spoke. "The evidence of undue influence and fraud is overwhelming," she said. "The original will, dividing assets equally between the children, is hereby reinstated. All transfers and documents made under forged signatures are void. Assets are to be returned to Harold Reed's estate immediately. Restitution and associated penalties will be determined following audit." She looked up from her papers, her voice firm. "This court finds that the defendants engaged in deliberate deception and exploitation of a vulnerable adult. This ruling stands as final." I didn't move. I didn't cheer or cry. I just let the words wash over me, steady and clear like a bell rung after a long silence. Claire placed a hand on my shoulder, and I saw her smile for the first time in months. A small, quiet smile of someone who had carried the weight of another's pain and finally set it down. As we stood to leave, Ethan's chair scraped loudly against the floor. He turned toward me, his face red with fury. "You'll never be part of this family again," he shouted, his voice echoing through the courtroom. I met his eyes and said calmly, "Good. I never was anyway." For a moment, something in his expression faltered, just enough to see the truth behind the rage. And then he looked away. Outside, the air was bright and cold. Reporters waited near the steps, microphones raised, cameras ready. Claire handled them, her answers precise and minimal. I stayed back next to Frank, watching the courthouse doors close behind me. Somewhere, deep inside, the tension I'd carried for years began to unwind. When we got home, Dad was waiting in his chair by the window. He looked at me, and I could tell he already knew. So he said softly, "It's done." "It's done," I said. He smiled faintly, and for the first time in a long time, his shoulders seemed to relax. Then, "Maybe now we can rest." I nodded, though something in me knew the rest wouldn't come easily. Justice had been served, but the storm wasn't over. The civil case had closed, but the criminal trial was still coming, and Ethan, I feared, wasn't finished fighting. But the criminal trial was still coming. And Ethan had one more card to play. It took almost 6 months for that card to hit the table, and when it did, it fell flat. The criminal trial began in late autumn in a courtroom colder than the one before, its walls lined with faces that had once trusted my brother. This time, it wasn't about inheritance or family. It was about fraud, forgery, and intent. The prosecution called witnesses one after another, and each one chipped away at the last fragments of the image Ethan had spent years crafting. Marcus testified first. He looked uneasy at the start, glancing at Ethan only once before addressing the judge. "I believed him," Marcus said. "I thought the money from Harold Reed was a legitimate investment. But the accounts showed something else. Business funds were used for personal expenses, cars, vacations, renovations. I didn't see it until it was too late." He handed over spreadsheets, invoices, and emails, each one another nail in the coffin. When Ethan took the stand, he tried to perform the role he'd perfected his entire life, the wronged son, the misunderstood man. But it didn't land anymore. The arrogance that once passed for confidence now looked like desperation. The jury didn't buy it. When the verdict came back guilty on all counts, financial exploitation, forgery, conspiracy to commit arson, it was quiet. Even Ethan didn't speak. He just stared straight ahead as the judge announced a sentence that would keep him behind bars for years. That was the legal ending. But life doesn't stop at verdicts. What came after was quieter, slower, but in many ways heavier. Marcus dissolved the company within a month. Ethan's professional license was suspended, his bank accounts frozen, and the Porsche he'd flaunted as proof of success was sold at auction to pay restitution. He moved into a small apartment before prison intake, a temporary holding space that reflected what his life had become, bare cold and borrowed. I heard from one of the court clerks that his calls went unanswered, even by old friends. The same people who once filled his parties and bragged about his business now crossed the street to avoid him. Linda's fall was different. It wasn't loud or public, it was slow erosion. After the court reinstated the original will, the house she'd claimed as her own was returned to Dad's estate. She tried to appeal, but the ruling was airtight. She sold most of her furniture, moved into a modest apartment on the edge of town, and stopped showing up at the club she used to run. Her friends, once so loyal, grew distant, some out of shame, some out of fear of association. I heard she still dressed up every morning, still kept her routines, but there was no one left to see them. For a long time, I thought I would feel satisfaction at that, but when I passed the street where her old house stood, all I felt was quiet. Justice doesn't always come with joy, it just settles the air, clears the fog, and lets you breathe again. Melissa called me a few months after the trial ended. Her voice sounded lighter than I'd ever heard it. "I started therapy," she said. "At first I thought it was just about getting over him. But it's not. It's about remembering who I was before he started telling me who I should be." We met for lunch soon after. She looked different, stronger somehow, standing taller. She told me she'd taken a job at a marketing firm in the city, a fresh start that paid less but gave her peace. "I don't check my phone 20 times a day anymore," she said with a smile. "And I don't feel like I have to explain myself to anyone." Before we parted, she reached across the table and said, "You saved my life, Sarah. You really did." I shook my head. "You saved your own. I just held the flashlight." Months later, she emailed a photo of her and a man named Alex. They were hiking, faces flushed from wind and laughter. He wasn't flashy or imposing. He looked kind. I smiled when I saw it. Kindness after everything felt revolutionary. While their lives rebuilt, piece by piece mine began to take shape again too, but in a different way. The trial had changed how people saw me. For years, I'd been the quiet designer, the reliable one who kept to herself. Now people came to me with questions, stories, gratitude. Neighbours dropped off casseroles during the sentencing week. Dad's old veteran friends visited every Sunday sometimes, just to sit on the porch with him and talk about old ships and lost friends. The local women's group invited me to speak at a community event about recognising financial abuse. I almost said no, I didn't see myself as a speaker, but Claire said, "Your story might keep someone else from breaking." So I said yes. That night, standing at the podium in the town hall, I told a room full of strangers what it meant to lose everything except the truth. I told them about the kind of manipulation that doesn't leave bruises, but breaks you just the same. And when it was over, people lined up to thank me. Some hugged me. One woman whispered, "My daughter's going through something like this." You gave me hope. Work followed, more than I expected. Clients wanted not just designs, but the story that came with them, the quiet proof that surviving could lead to creation. My little business expanded so quickly, I had to hire another employee. Sometimes when I locked up the studio late at night, I thought about how fragile the line between collapse and rebuilding really was. At home, things felt lighter too. Dad smiled more. Frank still came by with groceries and jokes that made him laugh even on the hard days. The house, once quiet and tense, was filled again with the sounds of life radio music, the scrape of dishes, the low murmur of conversation. One evening, I found Dad sitting on the porch, the sunset stretching gold across his face. He looked peaceful, his eyes half closed. "You did good, kiddo," he said softly when I sat beside him. "I didn't do it alone," I replied. He nodded, a faint smile playing on his lips. "No one ever does." The world kept turning after that slower, gentler. Justice had done its work, and all that was left was living. But even as life stitched itself back together, I could feel a change in the air. Something subtle. Dad tired more easily. His steps grew slower. Sometimes when he spoke, his words drifted off mid-sentence. At first, I told myself it was just age or the toll of stress. But deep down, I knew. The fight that had kept him standing all this time was ending. And though I tried to pretend otherwise, I could feel it, the quiet unravelling beneath the peace we'd built. But the biggest change was happening quietly, in my own home. Dad was fading. It started in ways so small I almost missed them. A forgotten cup of coffee left cooling on the counter. A nap that stretched into an afternoon. His steps grew slower, his voice softer, his appetite smaller. The doctor said it wasn't anything dramatic, just the heart slowing down, the body preparing to rest. But for me, it was like watching a candle burn lower each day, beautiful still, but shorter, quieter, softer at the edges. It had been a year since he'd moved in with me. 12 months of learning how to be a daughter again. For so long, I'd only known how to survive him, how to stay quiet to avoid upsetting the delicate balance of our family. But this year, we found something new. We learned how to share space without pain, how to talk without the ghosts standing between us. We built a rhythm together, steady and tender. Our evenings became sacred. I'd come home from work and he'd already be waiting in his chair by the kitchen window, the radio playing old country songs. "Smells good," he'd say as I started dinner, even if all I'd done was boil pasta. We'd eat together every night, always at the table, never in front of the TV. Sometimes he'd tell me about the Navy, about storms so fierce they made the whole ship shudder, or the jokes the crew told to keep from being afraid. Other nights, he'd ask about my clients, about fabrics, lighting, and colour theory words that must have sounded like another language to him, yet he listened as if every detail mattered. After dinner, we'd sit in the living room and watch old westerns. He loved those films, the dusty streets, the slow-talking heroes who always knew right from wrong. "They don't make 'em like this anymore," he'd say. I'd tease him for saying that every night, but secretly I loved it too. The ritual, the way the world seemed simpler for 2 hours. Sometimes he'd drift off in the middle of the movie, his breathing even and calm. I just watch him, the flicker of the TV light touching his face, and think about how strange and precious it was to have this peace after everything we'd been through. He taught me how to make his mother's cornbread. The secret, he said, is not in the recipe, it's in the sound. You stir until the batter sounds right. I laughed, then thinking he was teasing me, but I listened. And when it came out of the oven golden and crisp, he took one bite and smiled. You listened. That's half of cooking, half of life. Those were the moments that mended us small, ordinary things that carried the weight of forgiveness without ever needing to name it. But by late spring, I began to see the change. He tired more easily. Some days he wouldn't leave his chair. Once I found him staring at the garden, eyes unfocused, lost somewhere in thought. When I asked what he was thinking about, he said softly, "How much I wish I'd done it all differently. But at least I'm here now." One night, as I tucked a blanket over his legs, he reached for my hand. "I'm with my daughter," he said, voice barely above a whisper. Finally, got it right. He started telling me stories I'd never heard before, stories of his boyhood, of his father's strictness, of the first time he fell in love. One evening, he told me about the day I was born. "You were so tiny, Sarah," he said. "Your mother fell asleep after the delivery, and they let me hold you first. I was terrified I'd drop you. My hands were shaking so bad I practiced at home with a bag of flour before you came." He chuckled, the sound thin but warm. "I guess that's what being a dad is, practicing love until you get it right." I cried quietly that night when he fell asleep, because I finally understood that all the mistakes, all the distance came from fear, not from lack of love. The last week came quietly. He grew weaker, drifting in and out of sleep. Sometimes he'd wake and smile at me as if he were seeing someone else. Maybe my mother, maybe a memory. I didn't correct him. I just held his hand and let him rest in whatever peace his mind gave him. The night he died was one of those nights where everything feels still before it happens. I'd fallen asleep beside his bed, my hand in his. When I woke, the light through the window was grey and soft, and his chest no longer rose. He looked peaceful, almost like he was dreaming. There was no struggle, no fear, just quiet. I sat there for a long time, holding his hand, memorizing the lines of his face. When I finally stood, I opened the window. The morning air came in cool and clean. Somewhere a bird was singing. I whispered, "You did get it right, Dad." The funeral was small, just the way he wanted it. No grand displays, no fuss. The church was filled with the people who'd mattered most, his old Navy friends, in their pressed jackets, neighbours who'd known him for decades, the men he used to play cards with on Tuesdays. They stood in silence as the pastor spoke about kindness and humility, about second chances. Claire came, her eyes red, but proud. Melissa sat beside her new boyfriend, her hand resting gently in his. When she hugged me afterwards, she said, "He was proud of you, Sarah. You gave him peace. I tried to speak but couldn't, so I just nodded." After the service, as people drifted out into the afternoon light, I stayed behind to help the pastor close up. That's when I saw it, an envelope sitting on the piano near the altar. My name written in my father's shaky handwriting. I held it to my chest all the way home, afraid to open it, afraid that once I did, it would mean this was truly over. 3 days later, I sat in the living room with a cup of tea, the house too quiet. The chair where he used to sit now empty. I unfolded the letter carefully, the paper thin and worn, as if he'd written it long before he was ready to give it to me. "Sarah, my darling girl," it began. "If you're reading this, it means I've gone where old sailors go when they've had enough of dry land. I want you to know something I never said right. You were never the strong one because you didn't need me. You were strong because I failed you and you survived anyway. I'm sorry it took me so long to see that. I'm sorry for every time I let you stand alone when I should have stood beside you. Thank you for letting me love you properly at the end. Thank you for giving an old man a chance to feel like a father again. You gave me peace I never thought I'd earn. make your life beautiful, Sarah. Fill it with colour, laughter, and people who see you the way I should have all along. I'll be watching proud as ever. Love, Dad. I read it 3 times before I could breathe again. The tears came slowly, not sharp or bitter, but full, like rain after a drought. He was gone, but somehow I felt more connected to him than ever. That weekend, I planted a rose bush in the garden right under his window. He'd always said he liked things that came back every year that proved the cold couldn't win. Every morning after that, I'd open the curtains, touch the petals and whisper, "Morning, Dad." And every morning I could almost feel his answer in the quiet breeze. A week later, we held a small gathering at the cemetery, just close friends and neighbours. The sun was low, the air gentle. As I walked down the aisle of folding chairs, something caught my eye, a familiar figure standing near the back. Linda. She was thinner than I remembered her face, lined with something beyond age guilt, maybe, or loss. She didn't approach, just stood quietly with her hands clasped. As I passed her, she leaned forward slightly, her voice barely a whisper. "I'm sorry," she said. "I didn't stop. I didn't speak." But for the first time in years, I believed her. That was 6 months ago. Since then, the seasons had turned and grief had settled into something quieter, something that didn't hurt every minute but never really went away. I'd learned to live with the empty chair at the kitchen table, the unopened Western DVDs stacked by the television, and the rose bush outside that bloomed brighter than I expected. Life had found its rhythm again, one shaped by memory rather than loss. When the letter from the district attorney's office arrived, I already knew what it was. The criminal case had dragged on for more than a year, delayed by motions and hearings, the endless red tape that seemed to define justice. Claire had warned me this part might feel anticlimactic. "Courtroom justice," she said once, "is never as clean as it feels in your heart." She was right. The DA's letter confirmed what we'd expected. Ethan had accepted a plea deal. No trial, no cross-examinations, no witnesses forced to relive what he'd done. Just an agreement guilt on paper punishment in structure. The charges were clear. 4 counts of forgery, 1 count of identity theft, financial exploitation of an elderly person, conspiracy to commit arson, and a misdemeanor assault. I read it twice, the words flat and bureaucratic, yet heavy with finality. There would be no prison sentence. Instead, the plea included 5 years of probation restitution, totaling $180,000 to Dad's estate, 500 hours of community service and mandatory therapy sessions. His professional licenses were permanently suspended, and the record would stay with him forever. When I told Claire, she nodded slowly. "It's fair," she said. "Maybe not satisfying, but fair." I wasn't sure what fair meant anymore. Dad was gone. The money didn't matter. Nothing the court decided could rewrite what had happened. But there was a strange comfort in knowing the truth was written down somewhere official in ink that couldn't be erased. It wasn't about punishment, it was about acknowledgement. Linda's case followed soon after. She wasn't charged criminally. Ethan's plea had taken full responsibility. But the civil court issued its own judgment. She was ordered to repay $90,000, half of what had been taken, through a structured payment plan tied to her pension. It was, as Claire said, symbolic but meaningful. For the first time in her life, my mother was accountable for her choices. The sentencing hearing was held on a grey Tuesday morning in March. I didn't want to go at first. I'd sat through enough courtrooms, heard enough legal jargon to last a lifetime. But Claire said I should be there not for closure, but for presence. "You deserve to hear the end of your own story," she said. So I went. The courtroom felt smaller than before, maybe, because it was emptier. There was no press this time, no reporters scribbling notes or cameras waiting outside. Just a few rows of wooden benches, the echo of footsteps on marble, and the faint smell of coffee from the hallway. Ethan sat at the defence table, thinner than I remembered, his hair longer, his hands clasped tightly in front of him. Linda wasn't beside him. I didn't know whether she couldn't face it or wasn't invited, but her absence felt deliberate, almost merciful. When the judge read the charges aloud, Ethan didn't look up. He stood only when prompted, his voice barely audible as he said, "Guilty, Your Honour." The judge reviewed the terms of the plea agreement, her tone measured and stern. Given the defendant's cooperation, lack of prior criminal record and restitution already arranged, she said the court accepts the plea deal. Mr. Reed, your actions caused significant harm to your family and to a vulnerable elder. You are fortunate to have avoided prison, but understand this, your punishment is not leniency. It is a lifetime of consequences. He nodded once, eyes still fixed on the table. When the judge finished, the courtroom emptied quickly. Claire squeezed my hand before leaving to file paperwork. And suddenly I was alone. Alone, except for Ethan, who was gathering his papers, his movements slow and deliberate. I considered walking past him without a word, but something, maybe habit, maybe the ghost of family made me pause. He turned then, as if sensing me. His face was pale thinner, the confidence that once defined him stripped away. For a long moment we just looked at each other. The silence between us was dense, full of all the things that could never be said. Finally, he spoke. "I didn't want it to end like this," he said quietly. "Neither did I replied. He swallowed hard. "I know you won't believe me, but I am sorry for everything. For Dad, for you, for all of it." For a moment something in me softened. Maybe because I could see that he wasn't lying, not entirely. He was sorry, but not for the reasons I wanted him to be. He was sorry for losing everything, for being seen, for the reflection staring back at him in that courtroom. "I believe you're sorry you got caught," I said finally. My voice was steady, calm, even kind, because anger was a luxury I no longer needed. Then I turned and walked away. Outside the courthouse, the air was cold and clean. I stood on the steps for a while watching people pass, lawyers, clerks, strangers going about their lives, none of them knowing how much had just closed inside those walls. A few days later, the restitution payment arrived. A cheque made out to Harold Reed's estate, neat and impersonal. I stared at it for a long time before calling Claire. "What do I do with it?" I asked. She hesitated. "It's yours legally. You could reinvest it or donate it. Whatever feels right." That night, I wrote a letter to the director of the local Elder Justice Foundation, the non-profit, that had helped me navigate the maze of laws when this all began. I attached the cheque and added a note, "I don't want this money. I want it to mean something. Use it to help others who don't have a voice, who think no one will believe them. Help them before it's too late." When the foundation's director called to thank me, her voice broke. "You just funded 3 new caseworkers," she said. "You'll change lives with this." But the truth was, I didn't do it to change others. I did it to let go. The money had come from pain. Turning it into hope was the only way to strip it of its poison. Life after the sentencing felt different. Not easier, not exactly lighter, but grounded. The anger that had once lived in me like a fire had cooled into something steadier. Some days, I even caught myself thinking about Ethan without hatred. Just sadness. Linda called once after the judgment, her voice brittle but composed. "I'm making the payment," she said. "It will take time." "I know," I replied. "That's all that matters." There was a pause. "You're not doing this to punish me, are you?" "No," I said softly. "I'm doing it so it never happens again." She didn't answer, but I heard her exhale a sound that might have been relief or regret. Spring came again. The rose bush under Dad's window bloomed early that year, thick with colour. Sometimes when I stood by the window watering it, I thought about all the versions of my family that could have been the ones built on truth, not illusion. And for the first time, I didn't wish for them anymore, because the life I had now, the peace I'd earned, was enough. In the courthouse hallway, after sentencing, Ethan stopped me. "I'm sorry. I know you won't believe me, but I am." I looked at him and said, "I believe you're sorry you got caught." That was the last thing I said to my brother. It echoed in my head for weeks afterward, not out of bitterness, but because of how calm I'd been when I said it. That calm, I later realised, was the beginning of something new, a life no longer defined by surviving him. 18 months have passed since then. The seasons have turned twice over, and with them, so has my world. The house feels different now, not haunted, but full of motion and purpose. The rosebush outside Dad's window blooms thick every spring, and the smell always drifts in through the open kitchen door. I still talk to him sometimes while I cook, just like before. "You'd laugh at this, Dad," I'll say as I stir something new. And somehow, I can almost hear him answer. Work has become my heartbeat. What began as a small, one-woman design studio has grown into a full firm, 3 employees, 2 contractors, and a calendar booked 6 months out. We specialise in what I call fresh start spaces, homes for women rebuilding after loss or leaving toxic situations. The projects aren't glamorous, small condos, townhouses, rental apartments, but they're meaningful. Every colour choice, every light fixture, every open window is meant to remind someone this is yours and you deserve to feel safe here. A journalist from Home and Spirit magazine wrote an article about us last month, "Creating Peace Through Design," the headline said. I smiled when I saw it because that's exactly what I've been trying to do, build peace one home at a time. Melissa works with me now. It started with her helping out part-time organising samples and calling clients. Then she began shadowing me on-site visits, learning the craft one project at a time. "You showed me I could leave," she said one day as we painted a wall together. "Now I help others see they can too." She's good at it better than she realises. Clients trust her right away. She has a warmth I envy sometimes, the kind that can reach people without words. It was Melissa actually who pushed me to start the workshop. I'd resisted for months. "I'm not a speaker," I kept saying. "I tell stories with paint, not microphones." But she wouldn't drop it. "Sarah," she said, "people need to hear what you went through. They need to know what surviving looks like after the dust settles." And so, on an early Saturday morning in September, I stood at the front of a small community centre auditorium, staring at 40 women seated in folding chairs. They ranged from 45 to 70, some with notepads, others holding cups of coffee like lifelines. I took a deep breath and began. The workshop was called Financial Freedom After Family Trauma. It wasn't about money in the traditional sense. It was about ownership of choices, of boundaries, of self-worth. I started by telling them my story, not the headlines or the scandal, but the heart of it. The years of silence, of believing love meant shrinking, small enough to fit someone else's comfort. "My father once told me I was strong because I didn't need him," I said. He was wrong. I was strong because I learnt to stand again after falling. But I shouldn't have had to fall that hard to be seen. There was a hush in the room, the kind of silence that means people are listening, not with their ears, but with their memories. I talked about the cost of silence, how it eats away at you, one compromise at a time. I talked about boundaries, not as walls, but as the shape love takes when it's healthy. And I told them that worth isn't something anyone else can give or take. It's not a gift, I said. It's a fact. You were born with it. Hands started going up after that. One woman, maybe in her late 50s, asked, "What if it's too late? I've built my whole life around someone who won't change. What's the point of starting over now?" Before I could answer, another woman, grey hair in a loose bun, eyes tired but alert, spoke quietly. "I'm 62, she said. "I've been married 40 years. He's never hit me, but he controls every dollar, every choice. I don't even know what I'd do if I left. I think it's too late for me." The room fell still. I walked her closer, softening my voice. "My father found courage at 68, I told her. He'd lived a lifetime believing he was too far gone to fix things. But in the end, he learned it's never too late to love better, even if that love starts with yourself. The only too late is never." The woman nodded, tears glinting at the corners of her eyes. And in that moment, I felt something shift in the room, a quiet ripple of recognition, the sound of dozens of women realizing maybe they weren't trapped forever. After the break, Melissa spoke briefly about her own journey. She told them how she'd once given up her job, her friends, even her confidence for someone who called it love. Leaving wasn't the end, she said, looking out at the crowd. It was the start. And now I get to help others build something new, brick by brick. When the workshop ended, women lingered in small groups, talking softly, exchanging phone numbers, promising to keep in touch. One of them hugged me and whispered, "I wish my daughter could hear you." Another said, "I thought I was the only one." As I stood near the door, thanking people, I realised I wasn't trembling anymore. I wasn't hiding behind work or quiet composure. I was simply standing there, present, steady, whole. After everyone left, Melissa and I packed up the folding chairs, stacking them neatly against the wall. "You did it," she said, grinning. "We did it," I corrected. We locked up the centre and stepped outside. The sun was low, painting everything in gold. The air smelled faintly of autumn and coffee from the cafe across the street. Melissa hugged me before heading to her car, and I stood there for a while, watching her drive away, feeling something I hadn't felt in years: lightness. The kind that comes when the past finally loosens its hold. On the drive home, I replayed the day in my head, the faces, the voices, the tears that turned into laughter. Dad would have loved it, I thought. He would have sat in the back row, arms crossed, pretending not to cry. The road curved past the lake, the water catching the late sun. It felt like the world was exhaling with me. For the first time, I wasn't looking back. I was looking forward. When I pulled into the driveway, twilight was just beginning to settle. The porch light came on automatically as I walked to the mailbox. It was full: flyers, a magazine, a letter from the Design Association, but one envelope stood out. Plain white, slightly creased with a return address stamped neatly in the corner. Mountainside Rehabilitation Centre. I froze, the air catching in my throat. The name on the return line was written in the familiar, careful handwriting. From Ethan. After the workshop, I drove home, feeling lighter than I had in years. Then I saw the envelope in my mailbox. Return address, Mountainside Rehabilitation Centre. From Ethan. For a long time, I just stood there, the envelope cold between my fingers. The sun was setting behind the house, painting everything in a soft gold light, and for a moment the world felt too calm for what that small white envelope might hold. I hadn't seen or heard from my brother in almost 2 years. His sentencing had been the last chapter of that story, at least in my mind. I had closed it neatly, tucked it away, and built something new over the ruins. And yet, here it was, a piece of that past addressed directly to me. I carried it inside, but didn't open it. Instead, I placed it on the kitchen table and walked to the sink, washing my hands as if the paper itself were contaminated with old pain. The rosebush outside the window swayed in the evening breeze, its petals brushing lightly against the glass. I could almost hear my father's voice saying, "You don't have to open every door, Sarah." But this wasn't a door. It was a ghost knocking politely. I left it there overnight. The next morning, I sat down with a cup of coffee, stared at it again, and finally broke the seal. The handwriting was Ethan's, but shakier, uneven in places. The first line stopped me. "Dear Sarah, I'm writing this from Mountainside Rehabilitation Centre. I've been here for 97 days. He went on to explain that after sentencing, he'd spiralled further, drinking heavily, losing what little was left of his business, and eventually checking himself into rehab after a doctor warned him his liver was failing. He didn't blame anyone else. Not the courts, not Mum, not me. I destroyed my life, he wrote, but first I destroyed yours. I'm sorry for everything." For a long while, I didn't read further. My eyes stayed on those 2 sentences, trying to recognise the man who had written them. The tone was different, quiet, unguarded. There was no defensiveness, no self-justification, just a tired voice admitting its own wreckage. He wrote about guilt, how it had followed him like a shadow that wouldn't let him sleep. He said he saw Dad in his dreams, standing in the kitchen, saying nothing. "He doesn't look angry," Ethan wrote. "He just looks disappointed. And somehow, that's worse." Then came the part that made my breath catch. Mum's obsession with me was suffocating, he said. I used to think it meant she loved me more. Now I see it for what it was, fear. She needed me to be her success story, her proof she was a good mother. I let her need define me until I couldn't breathe. And when you didn't play along when you lived your life without asking for her approval, I hated you for it. I blamed you for being strong when I was weak. He didn't ask for forgiveness. In fact, he wrote explicitly that he didn't deserve it. I don't expect you to write back, he said. I just wanted you to know that you were right about everything. You were right about Dad, about Mum, about me. I hope your life is everything you deserve because I'm starting to understand what that word means. He ended it simply. Take care, Sarah. Maybe in another life I could have been the kind of brother you deserved. Ethan. When I finished reading, I sat still for a long time. The morning light had shifted across the table, and the coffee beside me had gone cold. I didn't know what to feel. Not anger, not forgiveness, just something quiet like the sound of the tide going out. I carried the letter to my therapist later that week. Dr. Meyer had been seeing me for 2 years now through grief, through rebuilding, through the long, uneven road toward peace. I handed her the envelope and she read it carefully, her brow softening. He's taking responsibility, she said after a while. That's rare. I know, I said, but I don't know what to do with that. It doesn't change anything. It's not supposed to, she said. It's not about erasing the past. It's about acknowledging it. Sometimes that's all closure needs to be. Her words sat with me for days. I reread Ethan's letter twice more before deciding to write one of my own. I didn't want to react out of guilt or obligation. I wanted it to be clear, honest, final. When I sat down to write, I didn't start with Dear Ethan. I just started with truth. I got your letter. I read it carefully. I believe you're trying to change, and I hope you do. I forgive you, not for your sake, but for mine. Because carrying hate is heavy, and I've carried enough. I hope you find peace, Ethan. But we will not have a relationship. That door is closed. Take care of yourself. I read it 3 times, each one slower than the last, testing the words for honesty. They felt right, steady, not cruel, not kind, just true. Before sealing it, I paused. For a moment, I wondered what Dad would think if he were here. Maybe he'd smile and say, "That's my girl." Or maybe he'd say nothing, just nod proud of the balance I'd found between strength and mercy. I signed my name, folded the paper and slipped it into an envelope. There was no trembling in my hands, no knot in my chest, just stillness. The next morning, I drove to the post office. The air was cool, brightened with early fall, the kind of day that feels like a clean slate. As I stood in line, I noticed the people around me, an older man mailing a birthday card, a young woman holding a package with pink ribbon. Life moving forward, always forward. When my turn came, I walked to the blue mailbox outside instead of the counter. The letter felt light in my hand. I ran my thumb over the edge of the envelope. Once more, out of habit, then hesitation. I thought about everything that had led here, the years of silence, the courtroom, the grief, the rebuilding. All of it had shaped me, but none of it owned me anymore. For the first time, I didn't see Ethan as the villain of my story. I saw him as a broken man trying to crawl out of the wreckage he built. That didn't excuse him, but it made it easier to wish him well quietly from far away. I took one last breath, slipped the letter through the slot, and listened as it fell into the box with a soft, final sound. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't emotional. It was just done. I sealed the letter, dropped it in the mailbox, and walked away. Free. That was 2.5 years ago. At the time, I thought freedom would feel like fireworks, loud, bright, undeniable. But it didn't. It felt quiet, like a door softly closing behind me. Since then, I've learned that real peace doesn't announce itself. It settles gently like dust in sunlight. So much has changed since that day. The life I have now bears almost no resemblance to the one I was fighting to survive back then. My design firm, once a dream scribbled in notebooks and coffee-stained folders, has grown into something I never imagined. We opened a second office downtown last spring, in a restored brick building with high ceilings and windows that catch the afternoon light just right. Every time I walk through that space, I think of my father's voice saying, "Make it beautiful." And I have. Our focus has evolved too. We still design homes, but now we specialise in what I call fresh start spaces. Places for women rebuilding after loss, divorce, or abuse. The work is deeply personal. Every client has a story, and we design with those stories in mind. One woman, Eleanor, was 61 when she came to us. Her husband had passed and her children lived out of state. "I want this house to feel like me," she said. We painted her kitchen the soft green of sea glass and built her reading nook by the window. When we finished, she cried, not from sadness, but from recognition. "I've hired a team of 6, now half of them women over 50 returning to the workforce. Many of them never thought they'd get another chance. Denise, my lead, textile coordinator, told me once, I used to think I was invisible. Now I feel seen every day. Watching them thrive has become my favourite part of the job. They remind me of my father in small ways, humble, hard-working, trying again no matter how late in life it seems." Last year, we launched the Harold Reed Second Chances Grant. It started as a simple idea after a client, a survivor of domestic abuse, confided that she couldn't afford to furnish her new apartment. I remembered how my father used to tell me, "If you've got enough to build something for yourself, build a little extra for someone else." So, I did. The grant provides financial aid to women rebuilding their lives, education, rent therapy, or small business help. We fund it partly from our profits and partly through donations from past clients who want to pay forward their own new beginnings. The first recipient, a woman named Carla, started a small catering business with her grant. She catered our company's anniversary dinner last month and brought an apple pie just like her dad used to make. As she served me a slice, she said, "You know, Harold's name is going to help a lot of people find their way back." I swallowed hard and smiled. It felt like he was still here, quietly helping people find home again, just as he'd done for me. My own family now looks nothing like the one I was born into, but it's richer, warmer, and real. Claire has become my closest friend and confidant. She still runs her law firm, but insists on bringing fresh bread every Sunday. Real bread, she says proudly, waving flour-dusted hands. Melissa comes too. Her laughter fills the house the way light fills a room. She's my assistant now, but more than that, she's my sister in all the ways that count. She's studying business management at night, determined to one day open her own design branch. "You showed me I could leave," she told me once. "Now I want to help others arrive." And then there are Dad's old friends, the veterans who used to play cards with him every Tuesday. They come over for dinner sometimes, still arguing about who cheats at poker. One of them, Frank, insists on fixing anything that breaks in my house, even things that aren't broken. "It's what your dad would have done," he says with a wink. Sometimes, when they tell stories about Harold, the laughter in the room sounds so much like his that I catch myself turning toward the sound before remembering he's gone. Sunday dinners have become a tradition, our own chosen family ritual. The table is always full, homemade food, mismatched plates, too many opinions about dessert. We talk, we laugh, and sometimes we cry. But mostly, we remind each other that family isn't something you're given. It's something you create piece by piece, moment by moment. A few months ago, I heard through a relative that my mother Linda volunteers at a senior centre now. Twice a week, apparently. She reads to the residents and helps serve meals. I didn't know what to think when I heard that. Part of me wanted to doubt it, to assume guilt was her motive. But another part, the quieter part, wondered if it was her way of making peace with herself, with Dad, maybe even with me. We haven't spoken since that last letter, years ago, and I've never tried to reach out. Some bridges don't need to be rebuilt, they just need to stop burning. But a few months after I heard about the senior centre, I went to visit Dad's grave and found a bouquet of fresh lilies placed beside his headstone. There was no card. Lilies had always been her favourite. I stood there for a long time looking at them, thinking about all the ways we fail each other and the small, quiet ways we sometimes try to make it right. I left the flowers untouched and added my own bouquet of sunflowers next to them, his favourite. It felt like some kind of unspoken truce. Now, 2.5 years later, peace has a different meaning. It's not the absence of pain, it's the acceptance of it. The grief has softened around the edges, and the anger has turned into understanding. I no longer look back wondering what could have been. I look forward knowing exactly who I've become because of it. This morning I drove out to the cemetery again. The air was crisp, the sky pale blue. The road was lined with trees already turning gold. I parked under the old oak near the entrance and walked the familiar path to Dad's resting place. The grass was well kept, and the little American flag placed by his stone fluttered gently in the breeze. I knelt down and brushed away a few leaves. "Hi, Dad," I said softly. "It's me." I told him about the new office, about the grant, about the team of women who remind me so much of his quiet resilience. I told him about Sunday dinners and how Claire insists on making too much food every time. And then I smiled. "I made it beautiful," I said, laying the bouquet of sunflowers against the stone, "just like you wanted." For a long moment, I stayed there listening to the wind move through the trees, carrying with it the faint hum of traffic from the road beyond. I imagined him sitting beside me, maybe in that old flannel shirt he loved, nodding quietly the way he always did, when he didn't have words big enough for what he felt. When I finally stood up, the sun had risen higher, warming my face. I took one last look at the headstone, then turned back toward the parking lot where my car waited for Simashikan, the same car he'd restored for me when I was 60. It took me years to fix it up again after he passed, but now it runs smoother than ever. As I drove home, the radio flickered to life, playing an old country song, the same one Dad used to hum under his breath while flipping pancakes on Saturday mornings. The melody wrapped around me like sunlight, familiar and comforting. The road stretched ahead wide and open, the horizon bright. For the first time, I didn't feel like I was moving away from something. I was simply moving forward. They say you can't choose your family, but that's not true. I chose myself, and that's when I became free. Thank you for listening to Sarah's story. If her journey touched you, if you found a piece of your own life somewhere in her fight for peace, I hope you'll stay with us for more stories like this. Stories about courage, forgiveness, and the quiet strength it takes to start over. Every week, we share a new chapter about ordinary people who find extraordinary ways to heal and rebuild. These aren't tales of perfection, but of persistence, proof that even after heartbreak and loss, life can still become something beautiful. If you haven't already, please take a moment to subscribe to the channel. It's the best way to make sure you don't miss what comes next, and it helps our little community of listeners grow. When you subscribe, you become part of something meaningful, a space where stories remind us that second chances are real, that love can take many forms, and that freedom sometimes begins with letting go. We'd love to hear from you too. What did Sarah's story mean to you? Did it remind you of someone in your own life or a time you had to find strength when it felt impossible? Leave your thoughts in the comments below. Your words might be exactly what another listener needs to hear tonight. And finally, if you believe in the power of stories that heal, share this one with someone who could use a reminder that it's never too late to begin again. Because sometimes hearing that one voice, steady, honest, and human, can be the thing that helps us all remember freedom isn't something we're given. It's something we choose.